The first time I noticed something was wrong, it was with my phone. I was sitting in my car, parked outside my apartment complex, scrolling through emails before heading inside. 1 second, I was staring at an unopened message from my boss. The next, my phone screen was blank. Not dead, just blank like someone had wiped it. The time was still there, the battery icon too, but everything else was gone. I restarted it, and everything was back. Weird glitch, I thought, but nothing worth freaking out over. Inside, I noticed my keys were missing from the hook where I always hung them. I searched my bag, my coat pockets, the counter. Finally, I found them sitting on the coffee table. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to distraction, but a faint unease prickled the back of my mind. I didn't remember putting them there. The next few days were a parade of minor inconveniences. My wallet disappeared, only to show up in the fridge. My car alarm went off in the middle of the night for no reason. I couldn't find my favorite mug, and when I did, it was in the cabinet upside down, filled with water. It was frustrating, but I told myself I was just being forgetful, distracted. Work had been stressful lately. I'd been feeling out of it. One evening, as I settled onto the couch to watch TV, I noticed something odd. My neighbor, Mrs. Lennox, was standing outside on the sidewalk, staring at my apartment. She didn't wave when I glanced out the window, didn't move at all, just stood there, motionless, her hands hanging limply at her sides. I watched her for a full minute before she turned abruptly and walked away without a word. It wasn't like her. She was usually cheerful, always stopping to chat. But again, I dismissed it. Maybe she was just having a bad day. The next morning, I bumped into her in the hallway. "Morning, Mrs. Lennox," I said, forcing cheerfulness into my voice. She looked at me, her face blank, and said, "I don't know you." Then she walked away without another word. I stood there for a long moment, trying to make sense of what just happened. She didn't know me? I'd lived in the building for 5 years, and we'd exchanged pleasantries at least twice a week since I moved in. I considered asking her what she meant, but something about her tone stopped me. It wasn't confusion. It was certainty. Later that day, I ran into Jake, the guy in 3B, in the laundry room. He nodded at me as he stuffed clothes into the dryer. "Hey, have you noticed anything weird lately?" I asked. Jake paused, frowned. "Weird how?" I hesitated. "Like people acting different, forgetting things, stuff not being where you left it." He chuckled. "Sounds like you need a vacation, man." Then he walked out, leaving me alone with the hum of the machines. The unease that had been simmering in the background for days started to bubble over. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening, something I couldn't explain. That night, I locked all the doors and windows before bed. As I climbed under the covers, I noticed the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. They were slow, deliberate, like someone was pacing. I held my breath, listening. They stopped, then started again, closer this time. I got up, opened the door, and looked out. The hallway was empty. The next morning, my routine was thrown off when I couldn't find my shoes. After searching everywhere, I found them in the trash can under the sink. I stared at them for a long time before pulling them out. The soles were clean, no sign of dirt or wear. It was as if they'd never been worn outside. I tried to tell myself I must have done it without realizing, but the thought felt flimsy, hollow. At work, things were even stranger. My coworker Lisa, who'd sat at the desk next to mine for 3 years, greeted me with a polite but distant smile. "You're the new guy, right?" she asked. "Welcome aboard." I laughed, assuming it was a joke, but her expression didn't change. "Oh, no, Lisa. It's me, Ryan. I've worked here for years." She blinked at me, her face a blank slate. "Sorry, I think you've got me mixed up with someone else." By now, the unease had turned into full-blown dread. I started keeping a journal, writing down everything that seemed out of place. I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. But even the act of writing felt strange. More than once, I'd look back at what I'd written the day before and find entire sections missing, words crossed out that I didn't remember crossing out. Then the people around me started to change. Subtly, at first, small shifts in mannerisms, expressions, the way they carried themselves. But soon, it became impossible to ignore. Mrs. Lennox, who once knitted on her porch, now sat for hours without moving, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Jake stopped responding to my greetings altogether, his face slack and emotionless. Lisa's cubicle was empty one morning, her belongings gone. When I asked HR, they said they'd never heard of her. I tried calling my parents, my friends, anyone who might anchor me to some kind of reality. But the numbers didn't connect. This number is no longer in service. A robotic voice would say, no matter who I dialed. My world was shrinking, folding in on itself. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I felt a presence in the room. I turned on the light, but no one was there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The air felt heavy, charged. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, so close it made my skin crawl. You don't belong here. The next morning, I found my reflection in the bathroom mirror wasn't following my movements. When I raised my hand, it stayed still, staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. I smashed the mirror with a trembling fist, shards raining into the sink. I haven't left the apartment since. The world outside feels alien, hostile. The people I see through the window move like puppets on strings, their motions jerky and unnatural. I'm not sure how much time has passed. The clock on the wall is stuck at 3:17, but the light through the window shifts between day and night with unsettling speed. Sometimes, I hear voices whispering just outside the door, fragments of sentences I can't piece together. I've stopped checking the hallway. I know I won't find anything there. Or worse, I will. Am I losing my mind? Or is something else pulling the strings? I don't know anymore. All I know is that I don't belong here, and maybe I never did. It started with a mug. A simple, nondescript white ceramic mug that I always left on the edge of the kitchen counter. That morning, I left it there before heading to work just like I always did. It still had the faint coffee ring at the bottom from my rushed sip before bolting out the door. But when I came home that evening, it was exactly the same, not just in position, but in every detail. The smudges on the handle were identical, the same faint coffee ring was still there, and even the angle of the handle hadn't shifted. I chalked it up to my memory playing tricks. Maybe I'd forgotten to rinse it out before leaving. The next day, I made a point to move it. I carried the mug to the sink, rinsed it thoroughly, and placed it on the drying rack. When I returned home later, the mug was back on the counter, in its usual spot. The coffee ring and smudges had returned too, as if I had never touched it. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, trying to reason with myself. Maybe I was mistaken. Maybe I thought about moving it, but never actually did. But then other things began to feel wrong. On Wednesday, I walked to the corner store like usual. On my way there, I passed a white car parked by the curb. Nothing special, just a dingy old sedan. I thought nothing of it. But on my way back, after spending 10 minutes inside the store, the same white car was parked in the exact same spot. I mean, not just in the same general location. It was positioned at the same angle, the tires aligned with the same crack in the pavement, the same small dent visible on the rear bumper. I stopped in my tracks, staring at it, as if it might explain itself. Someone could have moved it and then parked it back, I told myself, though even as I thought it, I knew it was absurd. By Thursday, I was on edge. The sense of repetition was everywhere, inescapable. I would glance out my window in the morning and see the same dog walker strolling past, the same yellow Labrador wagging its tail. Every morning, the exact same man, same leash, same pacing. When I made a note of the time, 8:17 a.m., I realized it was always the same minute too. The following day, I waited by the window, watching as the clock ticked down to 8:17. Sure enough, the man appeared, yellow leash taut as the Labrador trotted past. It wasn't just similar, it was exact. The déjà vu bled into my conversations. At work, my coworker Kate leaned over to me during lunch, telling me about her nephew's soccer game in the same cadence, with the same pauses, and the same joke about how 6-year-olds can't actually play soccer. They just chase the ball like a herd of sheep. She'd said it earlier in the week too, but when I brought it up, she stared at me blankly and laughed like it was the first time I'd ever heard the story. People's responses to me started to feel scripted, like actors in a poorly rehearsed play. Saturday night, I decided to go out. Anything to shake the strange loops that seemed to follow me everywhere. I hit up a bar I hadn't been to in months, hoping the change of scenery would help. It didn't. The bartender greeted me with a warm smile. but halfway through the evening, when I ordered my second drink, he made the exact same joke about the weather he'd made earlier. Word for word. Same inflection, same laugh. "This snow doesn't know if it's coming or going," he said, chuckling to himself. It was such an unremarkable comment that I wouldn't have noticed it if it hadn't already been said. By midnight, the sensation had become unbearable. The repetition wasn't just eerie, it felt suffocating, like I was trapped inside a loop I couldn't break. I left the bar, walking quickly to clear my head. The streets were mostly quiet, just the faint hum of traffic in the distance. Then I saw it again, the white sedan, parked under a street lamp this time, but it was the same car. I stopped, my breath clouding in the cold air, and walked closer. My heart thudded in my chest as I examined the details. The dent, the chipped paint near the taillight. It was impossible to tell how long I stood there, staring at that car, waiting for something to break the spell. And then it did. The street lamp flickered, just once, and the car vanished. It didn't drive off. It simply disappeared, as if someone had hit delete on a computer program. I stumbled backward, gripping a nearby lamppost for support. My ears were ringing, and I felt lightheaded, as though the ground beneath me might give way. I scanned the street, expecting to find some logical explanation, a hidden driveway, a trick of the light, but there was nothing. Just the empty space where the car had been. The days that followed blurred together. Time felt meaningless. I began noticing subtle shifts, as though the world around me was reloading in real time. I'd set my phone on the table, leave the room, and come back to find it on the couch. The same song would play on the radio twice in a row, the DJ's voice repeating his banter without acknowledgement. Even my own thoughts felt borrowed, like echoes of something I'd already said to myself. One night, desperate for answers, I tried staying awake. I wanted to see if I could catch the world resetting itself. I sat in the living room, staring at the mug on the counter. Hours passed, my eyes dry and heavy, until finally, just before dawn, I saw it happen. The mug flickered like a bad pixel on a screen, and was suddenly back in its original position, coffee ring and all. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't just coincidence or paranoia. Something was rewriting reality, and I was caught in its loop. It wasn't long before I began to wonder if I was the glitch. Maybe everything else was running perfectly, and I was the anomaly, the part of the program that wouldn't stay in sync. I tried testing it, walking in random patterns, speaking nonsense to strangers, refusing to follow my routines. But no matter what I did, the world around me stayed the same, unyielding in its precision. The mug still returned to the counter. The dog walker still appeared at 8:17. The white sedan was still there, waiting for me on the street. Eventually, the fear gave way to resignation. Whether I was trapped in a simulation or losing my mind, the result was the same. The repetition wasn't stopping, and I couldn't escape it. One night, as I stared at the mug, I caught my reflection in its polished surface. I thought I saw myself blink, just a fraction of a second before my real eyes did. It started with the toaster. It had worked fine yesterday or maybe the day before, but today it seemed to have developed some kind of personal grudge. The toast wasn't burned exactly, more like it had been gently warmed and then given up halfway. I poked at it, hoping the act of prodding might magically fix whatever was wrong. Of course it didn't. The toaster just sat there, smug and useless, while I stood in the kitchen holding a slice of bread that was neither toast nor bread. A metaphor for my life, if ever there was one. I ate it anyway because it felt like giving up to make another slice, and I was already running late for work. The drive to the office was no better. Traffic was its usual brand of maddening, bumper to bumper for no discernible reason, as if everyone had collectively decided to move as little as possible in unison. I sat in the car, the radio mumbling background noise while I stared at the endless sea of brake lights. A billboard for some local injury lawyer loomed over the highway, the smiling face of a man who probably made a killing off other people's bad days. I thought about calling in sick. It wasn't like anyone would care if I did. I'd barely made a ripple in the office since I started. But calling out felt like another kind of surrender, so I kept inching forward one agonizing car length at a time. By the time I got to work, my shirt was clinging to my back in that damp, uncomfortable way that only stress and an overheated car could achieve. The office smelled faintly of burnt coffee, the air heavy with the hum of computers and the occasional hollow laughter of coworkers making jokes that weren't funny. My desk was exactly as I'd left it. Neat enough to suggest I was competent, but cluttered just enough to imply I was busy. I sat down, booted up my computer, and stared at the email icon blinking on my screen like it was taunting me. 11 new messages. None of them important. I opened one out of obligation, skimmed it, and closed it without replying. The rest could wait. Or disappear. Either would be fine. The day dragged the way days always drag when you're counting every minute. I made a half-hearted attempt at productivity, clicking through spreadsheets and typing out emails that didn't need to exist. Around noon, I debated whether to actually take my lunch break or just sit at my desk pretending to work. The cafeteria's menu promised something called beef surprise, which seemed more like a warning than a meal, so I stayed put. My stomach growled in protest, but I ignored it, focusing instead on the tiny plant on my desk. A gift from someone I couldn't remember. It had been steadily wilting for weeks despite my occasional attempts to water it. I poked at the soil with a pen, wondering if plants could die of apathy. If they could, this one was doomed. By mid-afternoon, the office was a graveyard of slouched shoulders and glazed-over eyes. The sound of a printer jamming broke the monotony, followed by a string of curses from whoever was unlucky enough to be using it. I considered getting up to help, but decided against it. Heroics weren't in my job description. Instead, I opened a browser tab and stared at flights to nowhere in particular. Europe? Too expensive. The Caribbean? Too sunny. I closed the tab and sighed. Even escapism was out of reach today. At 5 o'clock, I bolted. The parking lot was a minefield of slow-moving cars and people pretending they weren't in a hurry to leave. I slid into my car and turned the key, the engine groaning like it shared my mood. The drive home was marginally better than the drive in, mostly because I'd stopped caring about how long it took. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the sun was already sinking, casting long shadows over the unkempt lawn I kept promising to mow. Inside, the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels more like an absence than a peace. I tossed my bag onto the couch and stared at the walls, half expecting them to cave in under the weight of my ennui. The toaster was still sitting on the counter, where I'd left it, a silent reminder of the morning's defeat. I considered throwing it out just to make a point, but decided it wasn't worth the effort. Instead, I opened the fridge, grabbed the first thing I saw, yogurt expired, and sat down at the kitchen table. The text came in while I was scraping the bottom of the yogurt cup. It was from an unknown number, a single line of text. "Hey, it's me. You free to talk?" I stared at it, my brain fumbling to match the words with a person. Me could have been anyone. A friend I hadn't spoken to in years. An ex who wanted to dredge up old memories. A wrong number. I debated ignoring it, but curiosity won out. "Who is this?" I typed back, my thumb hovering over the send button longer than necessary before I pressed it. The response came quickly. "You know who." I didn't, but there was something about the message, cryptic, casual, that tugged at me. Before I could reply, another text appeared. "Let's meet. Same place as before." I didn't know what before meant, but I also didn't want to admit that. So, against my better judgment, I typed, "When? Now." The clock on the wall read 7:13. The thought of going out, of putting on real shoes and facing the world felt like an insurmountable task. But there was something about the messages, a strange sense of urgency, a pull I couldn't quite explain. I stood up, tossed the yogurt cup into the trash, and grabbed my keys. The drive was aimless at first. I didn't know where I was going, but the messages felt like a clue, a breadcrumb trail I was compelled to follow. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes with small towns on weeknights. Streetlights flickered as I drove past, casting shadows that danced in the corners of my vision. I ended up at the park, the one I used to visit when I needed to clear my head. It was empty, save for a lone figure sitting on a bench under a dim street lamp. I parked, hesitating for a moment before stepping out. The air was cold, biting at my skin as I walked toward the figure. As I got closer, they stood, their face still obscured by the shadows. "Thought you wouldn't come," they said, their voice familiar but unplaceable. "Who are you?" I asked, my breath visible in the chill. They stepped into the light, and for a moment, it felt like the ground shifted beneath me. The face staring back was my own. I don't think I've told this story to anyone outside of my family, and even then, we don't like bringing it up. Not because we've forgotten, it's burned into all our memories, but because talking about it feels like it might bring it back somehow. Even after all these years, the thought sends a chill down my spine. This happened when I was 14, during one of those blistering summer weeks when school was out, and there wasn't much to do except hang out at home. My parents were both working late shifts at the time, and my older sister, Megan, was supposed to be watching me, though she spent most of her time in her room on the phone with her boyfriend. We lived in a small, one-story house on the edge of town, surrounded by nothing but a few neighbors and a lot of open farmland. It wasn't the middle of nowhere, but it felt like it sometimes. The kind of place where nights are so quiet that you can hear the slightest creak in the house and the wind whispering through the cornfields outside. That night started like any other. Megan was holed up in her room with her music blasting, and I was in the living room watching TV, flipping through channels aimlessly because nothing good was on. Our dog, Max, a lazy golden retriever, was sprawled out on the floor, snoring softly. It was just after 10 p.m. when I heard it for the first time, a faint tapping sound like someone gently knocking on glass. I paused the TV, thinking maybe it was Megan trying to get my attention. But the sound wasn't coming from the direction of her room. It was coming from the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. Our backyard wasn't big, just a small patch of grass with a rickety wooden fence and a few trees at the back. Beyond, there was nothing but empty fields stretching into darkness. I figured it was probably just a branch from one of the trees tapping against the glass, but when I got up to check, there was nothing there. The glass door was closed, the curtains drawn halfway open, and the yard was empty. I shrugged it off and went back to the couch. The tapping started again, louder this time. Max's ears perked up, and he lifted his head, letting out a low growl. That wasn't like him. Max was the kind of dog who greeted everyone like they were his best friend, even strangers. Hearing him growl like that put me on edge. I crept back to the sliding door, my heart thudding in my chest. This time, I pulled the curtain all the way open. The yard was still empty, but there was something off. The air felt heavier, like the kind of oppressive stillness you get before a thunderstorm, except the sky was clear. I told myself I was being stupid and went to grab a drink from the kitchen to calm my nerves. That's when I heard Megan scream. Not an annoyed yell or an angry shout. This was a full-on scream of terror. I dropped the glass I was holding, and it shattered on the tile floor. My feet were moving before I even registered what I was doing, racing down the hall to her room. Her door was open, and she was standing in the middle of her room, pale as a sheet, staring at her window. I followed her gaze, but all I saw was the reflection of her desk lamp in the glass. "What's wrong?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't answer right away. She just kept staring at the window like she was expecting something or someone to appear. Finally, she whispered, "There was a face. Someone was looking at me." My blood ran cold. Her window faced the side yard, but there was nothing there except a narrow strip of grass and the fence. Nobody could have been there without us hearing them jump the fence or walk through the gravel driveway. I tried to convince her it was her imagination, but she wasn't having it. Megan wasn't the type to scare easily, and the look on her face told me she wasn't joking. We decided to double-check the house, just to be safe. I grabbed the baseball bat from my room, and Megan armed herself with a flashlight. We went from room to room, turning on all the lights and checking every window and door. Everything was locked up tight. Even Max, who had followed us nervously, didn't seem to sense anything anymore. By the time we finished, Megan seemed a little calmer, but neither of us wanted to go back to our rooms. We ended up camping out in the living room with Max lying protectively between us. It was around 2 a.m. when we heard it again. The tapping. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the sliding door. It was coming from the window in the kitchen. Megan and I froze, staring at each other. The kitchen was just around the corner from where we were sitting. The lights were off in there, and from where we were, we couldn't see the window. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, like someone was making sure we knew they were there. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I gripped the baseball bat tightly and crept toward the kitchen, Megan following close behind with the flashlight. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whoever was outside could hear it. When I reached the doorway, I took a deep breath and flipped on the light. The kitchen was empty, and the tapping stopped the moment the light came on. I edged toward the window, half expecting to see a face staring back at me, but there was nothing. The yard was empty, just like before. We didn't sleep that night. Every little sound made us jump, and even Max seemed on edge, pacing back and forth between us. When my parents got home the next morning, we told them everything. My dad went outside to check the yard and found something that made my stomach drop. In the dirt just outside the kitchen window were footprints. Body footprints? They were large, too big to belong to any of us, and the way they were spaced out didn't make sense. It was like whoever or whatever made them had been standing perfectly still for hours. We never figured out who it was or what they wanted. My dad installed motion sensor lights and cameras after that, but nothing like it ever happened again. Still, I can't shake the feeling that whatever it was that night, it wasn't just some random creep messing with us. The way the air felt, the way Max reacted, the way the tapping seemed to follow us, it all felt wrong, like something was deliberately trying to scare us. And it succeeded. To this day, I can't hear tapping on a window without feeling that same cold dread creep over me. It began with a wrong number. I was sitting on my couch, scrolling mindlessly through my phone, when it rang. The number wasn't saved in my contacts, but it had the same area code as mine, so I assumed it might be a neighbor or a delivery driver trying to find my place. "Hello?" I answered. There was a pause, and then a voice came through, soft and uncertain. Is this Rachel?" "No," I said. "You've got the wrong number." "Oh," the voice replied. It was a woman, and she sounded distracted, almost like she was talking to herself. "I'm sorry. I thought." She stopped mid-sentence. "Are you sure you're not Rachel?" Her tone shifted, sharp and insistent, and something about it sent a chill down my spine. "I'm sure," I said, suddenly uneasy. "You've got the wrong number." Another long pause. "Well," she said, and her voice was low now, almost a whisper. "She's going to call you back." "Don't answer." Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stared at my phone for a moment, my heart racing. The call had left me rattled, but I tried to brush it off. People are weird sometimes. Maybe she was drunk, or maybe she really thought I was someone else. Either way, it wasn't my problem. I went back to scrolling, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. An hour later, my phone rang again. This time, the number was different, unknown, no caller ID. For a moment, I thought about letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity got the better of me, and I picked up. "Hello?" Static. "Hello?" I said again, louder. There was a faint crackling sound, like someone shifting on the other end of the line. And then, just as I was about to hang up, I heard it. A voice, faint and distorted, but unmistakable. "Rachel." I froze. It wasn't a question. It wasn't asking if I was Rachel. It was saying my name over and over, soft and insistent, like a chant. "Rachel, Rachel, Rachel." "I'm not Rachel," I said, my voice shaking. "You have the wrong number." The voice stopped. For a moment, there was only static. And then, "Why did you answer?" The line went dead. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was just a prank. Someone messing with me, trying to freak me out. But when I looked at my call log, there was no record of either call. That was when I noticed the text. It came from a number I didn't recognize, sent sometime in the middle of the night. "You should have listened." The word sent a jolt of fear through me. But what made it worse was the photo attached. It was a picture of my living room. I called the police, but there wasn't much they could do. They sent an officer to check out my apartment, but there were no signs of a break-in. They suggested I change my locks and get a security camera, but their tone made it clear they thought I was overreacting. That night, I got another call. This time, I didn't answer, but the voicemail was worse. It was the same voice from before, whispering my name, but now it was layered, overlapping itself in an eerie, discordant way. "Rachel, Rachel, Rachel." At the end of the message, the voice dropped to a low, guttural growl. "You shouldn't have answered." The calls kept coming. Every night, always from unknown numbers. Sometimes I answered, just to scream at whoever was to leave me alone, but all I ever heard was static in that voice. Other times, I let it ring, only to find more texts waiting for me in the morning. Pictures of my apartment, pictures of me, asleep in my bed. I started staying with friends, but it didn't help. The calls followed me, the texts kept coming, and the pictures grew stranger. One showed me standing in the kitchen, except it wasn't my kitchen. It was my childhood home, a place I hadn't been in years. Another showed me walking through a park I didn't recognize, wearing clothes I didn't own. Then the dreams started. In the dreams, I was always in a dark room, lit only by the faint glow of my phone screen. The air was heavy, the walls pressing in around me, and I could hear the voice. Rachel, Rachel, Rachel. I'd wake up gasping, my skin clammy, my phone clutched in my hand. Last night, I got a final message. It was a video. When I opened it, my screen filled with static, and for a moment, I thought it was another prank. But then the static shifted, resolving into an image. It was me, sitting on my couch, staring at my phone. I felt my blood turn to ice as I realized I was wearing the same clothes, holding my phone in the same way. It wasn't just a video of me, it was a video of me right now. The camera zoomed in, focusing on my face. My eyes looked wide and scared, and then the static returned, loud and jarring. The screen went black, and a single message appeared. Don't look behind you. I didn't. I ran. It was just past midnight, and I was in the kitchen, stirring sugar into my tea. The sound was faint at first, so soft I thought I'd imagined it. But then it came again. Knock, knock. I froze, the spoon still in my hand, and glanced toward the front door. I wasn't expecting anyone. It was too late for visitors, and my neighbors rarely spoke to me, let alone stopped by unannounced. Knock. This time it wasn't at the door. It was at the window. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I turned slowly, my eyes darting to the glass. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of something. Someone standing on the other side. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Knock. The sound was deliberate, rhythmic, as though the person on the other side knew I was there. I edged closer, heart pounding, and pulled the curtain back an inch. There was nothing there. The street outside was empty, bathed in the weak glow of the lamppost. I stood there for a moment, staring out into the darkness, before letting the curtain fall back into place. I told myself it was just my imagination. The wind, a bird, something small and insignificant. But deep down, I didn't believe it. I barely slept that night. The next evening, it happened again. This time, I was in the living room, scrolling aimlessly on my phone, when the knock came. Knock, knock. I felt it more than I heard it, the vibration running through the floor, the walls. My stomach twisted as I stared at the front door. Knock. But when I opened it, the hallway was empty. It didn't stop after that. Every night, the knocking came. Sometimes at the door, sometimes at the windows, sometimes at the walls. Always deliberate, always rhythmic. And always when I was alone. I stopped answering it after the third night. The fourth night was different. The knocking started around midnight, as usual, but this time it didn't stop. It moved door, window, wall, ceiling like it was circling me, like it was testing the boundaries. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it went quiet. I stayed on the couch, clutching my phone like a lifeline, and listened. The silence was deafening, pressing in on me from all sides. And then the voice came. Soft, almost melodic, but wrong in a way I couldn't explain. Let me in. The words seemed to echo in the air, though I knew they hadn't come from outside. They were inside the house. I ran to my bedroom, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I called the landlord, desperate for answers. He sounded tired, almost bored, as he told me what I already knew. No one's lived in that building for years. You're the first tenant in a long time. Why? I asked, my voice trembling. He sighed. People said it was haunted, he admitted, like he didn't want to say the words out loud. But that's just rumors. Superstition. I hung up and spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself that's all it was. But the knocking came again that night. This time, it was louder, more insistent, shaking the walls with each hit. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. Knock, knock, knock. I shouted at it, screamed at it to go away, but the knocking only grew louder. And then it stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. I slowly lowered my hands, listening, waiting. A breath. Not mine. It was right behind me. I turned, and for the first time, I saw it. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even close. Its shape was wrong, shifting and flickering, as though it couldn't quite decide what it wanted to be. Its face, or what I assumed was its face, was a mess of jagged lines and empty voids, and its eyes burned like coals. "Let me in," it said again, its voice scraping against my mind like nails on glass. I ran. I don't remember how I got out of the apartment, but I found myself standing in the street, barefoot and trembling, as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon. I never went back, but sometimes late at night, I still hear it. Knock, 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 and I know it's waiting. When I moved into the new apartment, I was relieved more than anything else. It wasn't glamorous, a second-floor unit in an older building with creaky floors and yellowing walls. But the rent was cheap, and the landlord didn't ask too many questions. I needed a fresh start after the breakup and leaving my last job. I told myself it was cozy, a blank slate, and I was eager to settle in. The first night passed uneventfully, save for the usual new place jitters. The faint hum of the fridge and the occasional groan of the pipes were nothing I hadn't heard before in older buildings. I unpacked just enough to make it livable, kitchen basics, clothes, and a few books, and left the rest of the boxes stacked in the corner of the living room. My mattress was still on the floor, but I didn't care. It was my space, finally mine, and that was enough to let me sleep deeply. The second night, I noticed something small but odd. One of the boxes in the living room was slightly ajar. It wasn't much, just the top flap leaning open as if I'd been careless closing it. I figured I must have brushed against it earlier and didn't think much of it. But then, as I reached to close it, I realized the contents weren't how I remembered packing them. The books were stacked haphazardly instead of spines out like I'd arranged. A postcard I hadn't seen in years was sticking out from the middle of the pile. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to my own rushed packing and tiredness. The next morning, the box was closed again, sealed neatly with the tape I'd used. I frowned at it, unsure if I'd done it without remembering. The rest of the apartment seemed fine, so I shrugged it off and went about my day. Over the following days, more small things started catching my attention. A chair at the kitchen table would be slightly out of place. The bathroom mirror seemed lower than I remembered, as if someone had adjusted it. My toothbrush was damp one morning, even though I hadn't used it yet. None of it was dramatic, just enough to make me feel a little uneasy. I told myself I was still adjusting to the new space and probably misremembering details. A week later, I came home from work to find the stack of boxes completely rearranged. The largest one, which I distinctly remembered being on the bottom, was now on top. I froze in the doorway, my stomach lurching. Someone had been in my apartment. I checked the locks, but they were intact. I searched every room, every closet, even under the bed. Nothing was missing, and there was no sign of forced entry. I convinced myself it must have been the landlord checking something while I was out, though I couldn't explain why he would move my things around. That night, I dreamed of someone standing in the corner of my bedroom, silent and still. When I woke up, the air in the apartment felt heavier, like the humidity had suddenly spiked. The curtains I'd drawn closed before bed were slightly open, just enough to let a sliver of moonlight spill onto the floor. My heart raced, but I told myself it was the draft from the poorly sealed windows. The changes became more noticeable after that. My keys, which I always left on the kitchen counter, started turning up in random places: the bathroom sink, the bookshelf, even inside the fridge once. A photo of my family that I hadn't unpacked, yet was suddenly sitting on the coffee table. My kitchen clock, which had been dead since I moved in, now ticked steadily despite me never replacing the battery. I was losing my grip on what was real and what wasn't. I started marking things with tape, drawing little X's in the corners of furniture or sticking post-it notes on objects to remind myself where they were supposed to be. It didn't help. Every morning, I woke up to find things moved, erased, or shifted just enough to make my stomach churn. The messages started a few nights later. At first, it was scribbles on random pieces of paper, a grocery list with items I'd never buy, a note that simply read, "Stay." Then the messages became more direct. "You don't belong here" was scrawled across my bathroom mirror in what looked like condensation. "Leave now" appeared on the dusty window pane in my bedroom. My chest tightened every time I saw them. I tried to tell myself it was a prank, that someone was sneaking in, but the locks were always secure, and I hadn't seen a soul near my apartment except the elderly woman in the unit below me. One night, I decided to set up my phone to record while I slept. I angled it toward the bedroom door, expecting to catch nothing but hours of silence. When I reviewed the footage the next morning, I nearly dropped the phone. Around 3:15 a.m., the door creaked open, though I knew I had locked it. A dark shape, featureless and almost liquid in its movements, slipped into the room and stood by the bed. It didn't move, just stood there, looming over me for what felt like hours before silently retreating. The door closed behind it. I should have left right then, packed up, broken the lease, whatever it took to get out. But I didn't. I told myself it was a trick of the light, maybe a neighbor's shadow cast by headlights outside. I was scared, but I was stubborn, too stubborn to run. The last night I spent there, I woke up to a new sound. A soft tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from the living room. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to investigate. The apartment was pitch black, save for the faint glow of a street lamp outside. The tapping grew louder as I approached the living room. When I rounded the corner, I froze. All the furniture had been pushed to the edges of the room, forming a perfect circle. In the center, a figure crouched, its limbs long and angular, its face obscured by shadows. It didn't move, didn't even seem to notice me at first. Then it slowly turned its head, and though I couldn't see its eyes, I knew it was looking at me. I ran. I didn't grab my keys, my phone, anything. I bolted out of the apartment and didn't stop until I was halfway down the block. When I returned with the police hours later, the apartment was empty. Everything was back in its place. No sign of forced entry, no sign of the figure. The officers didn't believe me, but I didn't care. I never went back. I didn't even bother breaking the lease. Whatever was in that apartment, it wanted me gone, and I wasn't going to wait around to see what would happen if I stayed. I've always loved bookstores. There's something comforting about wandering through aisles of books, their spines lined up neatly, the smell of old paper hanging in the air. That's probably why I didn't think twice about stepping into Bell's Rare Books when I first saw it. It was raining, and the shop appeared like a mirage as I turned the corner on my way home. I hadn't noticed it before, which was odd because I walked that route nearly every day. The sign above the door was hand-painted, its lettering slightly faded, and the display window featured an assortment of dusty tomes that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. Inside, the shop was cramped but cozy, the kind of place that felt like it had existed forever. Shelves stretched to the ceiling, packed with books of every shape and size. A faint smell of lavender mixed with old leather filled the air. The man behind the counter looked like he belonged there, thin, gray-haired, with round spectacles perched on his nose. He glanced up as I entered and gave me a nod, but didn't say anything. I wandered through the aisles, running my fingers along the spines of books I didn't recognize. Most of them had no titles, just worn covers with faint embossing. The farther I walked, the quieter the shop seemed to grow, the sound of the rain outside fading into nothing. That's when I saw it. It was a small book, tucked between two larger volumes on a high shelf. The cover was a deep, inky black with no title or markings, but something about it drew me in. I reached for it, the leather smooth and cool under my fingertips. The man behind the counter appeared beside me almost instantly, startling me so badly I nearly dropped the book. "That one's not for sale," he said, his voice low and measured. "Sorry," I said, holding it out to him. "It just caught my eye." He didn't take it. Instead, he stared at the book like it was something dangerous. "You shouldn't open it," he said. I hesitated. "Why not?" He didn't answer. After a moment, he shook his head and stepped back, disappearing into the labyrinth of shelves. I should have listened to him. I really should have. But curiosity has always been my downfall. I opened the book. The pages were blank at first, thick, yellowed paper with faint watermarks that looked like swirling patterns of smoke. But as I flipped through, words began to appear, faint at first, then darker, as if they were being written in real time. "You are here." I froze. The words were in the center of the page, written in elegant script. Beneath them, more words appeared. "Do you wish to see?" My mouth went dry. "See what?" I muttered aloud, though I wasn't sure who or what I was asking. The words shifted again. "The truth." I should have closed the book, walked out, never looked back. Instead, I turned the page. The next page was different. It wasn't blank. It was a sketch, detailed, intricate, and horrifying. It showed me standing in the bookstore, holding the book. But the details were wrong. My eyes were wide and sunken. My mouth stretched into a silent scream. Behind me, something loomed. I slammed the book shut and spun around. The shop was empty. The man at the counter was gone, the shelves stretching endlessly in every direction. The air felt thicker, colder, the lavender scent replaced by something metallic and sharp. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing faintly. No answer. I turned back to the book, desperate to make sense of what I'd seen. The cover now bore a single word in gold lettering: "Run." The lights in the shop flickered, and the shadows seemed to grow deeper, stretching across the floor toward me. A low hum filled the air, rising in pitch until it became an unbearable screech. I ran. I don't remember how I made it out of the shop, but when I stumbled back onto the street, gasping for air, the rain had stopped, and the sky was an eerie shade of gray. The shop was gone. In its place was a blank brick wall, slick with rainwater. I tried to tell myself it was a hallucination, some bizarre dream brought on by exhaustion or stress. But when I got home, the book was on my coffee table, waiting for me. I've tried getting rid of it, burning it, burying it, throwing it into a river. It always comes back, and every time I open it, the sketches are worse. Last night, the book showed me a new page. It was a drawing of my apartment, the walls covered in scratches, the windows shattered. And in the center of the room was a figure, tall and shadowy, with hollow eyes that stared directly at me. Beneath the drawing were two words: "Not long." I don't know what will happen when the book finishes its story, but I can feel it watching me even now, and I know I won't be able to close it in time. I didn't mean to buy the painting. It was one of those late-night auctions online where people offload antiques, weird trinkets, and questionable art. I wasn't even planning to bid. I'd only logged in to kill some time. But then the painting popped up on the screen. It wasn't particularly striking. The colors were muted, almost dreary, shades of gray and brown, with the occasional hint of gold. It showed a small house on a hill, surrounded by leafless trees. The house itself was simple, with a steep roof and a single, unlit window. But something about it drew me in. I found myself staring at the screen, my finger hovering over the bid button. The details in the painting were unnerving. The trees seemed to twist unnaturally, their gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like claws. The hill was steep and uneven, with shadows that didn't quite make sense. And the house felt alive. The longer I looked at it, the more I felt like it was looking back at me. I bid before I even realized what I was doing. No one else seemed interested, and within minutes, the painting was mine. When it arrived a week later, I immediately regretted it. The package was heavier than I expected, wrapped in brown paper and twine. The painting itself was larger than it had looked online, and up close, the details were even more unsettling. The shadows beneath the trees were deeper, almost black, and the house seemed slightly crooked, as if it were leaning toward the viewer. I told myself it was just a piece of art, but I didn't hang it up. Instead, I propped it against the wall in my living room, still half wrapped in paper, and tried to forget about it. That night, I had the first dream. I was standing at the bottom of a hill, looking up at the house. The air was cold, and the trees swayed even though there was no wind. The house loomed above me, its single window glowing faintly like a dying ember. I felt compelled to climb the hill, my feet moving against my will. The closer I got, the more the air seemed to thicken, weighing me down. By the time I reached the top, my chest was tight, and the house towered over me, its door ajar. I woke up before I could go inside. The next morning, the painting was in a different spot. I'd left it leaning against the wall, but now it was upright, standing in the middle of the living room. I didn't remember moving it. Maisie, my cat, was sitting a few feet away, her fur bristling, her eyes fixed on the canvas. Okay, I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the unease. Enough of this. I picked up the painting, intending to shove it into a closet, but the moment my hands touched the frame, I felt it. The wood was cold, unnaturally cold like ice, and the air around me seemed to hum faintly. My vision blurred, and for a split second, I thought I saw something move in the corner of the canvas. I dropped it and stumbled back, my heart pounding. That night, the dream came again. This time, I made it inside the house. The interior was dark and empty, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and rot. The walls were bare, but the shadows moved, twisting and writhing as if alive. I heard footsteps above me. Slow, deliberate. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Instead, I climbed the stairs, each step groaning under my weight. At the top was a single door. It creaked open as I approached, revealing a small room lit by a flickering candle. The painting was there, leaning against the far wall. But now, the house was gone. The canvas was empty except for the trees, which seemed closer, their branches reaching out of the frame. I woke up gasping, my chest tight, my skin clammy. When I went into the living room, the painting was waiting for me. It was back on the wall, perfectly centered, even though I hadn't hung it. The house was still there, but something about it was different. The shadows were deeper, and the window glowed faintly, just like in the dream. I tried to get rid of it. I drove to a thrift store across town and left it on their doorstep. But when I got home, it was back, leaning against the wall as if it had never left. I tried burning it. The flames wouldn't catch. I threw it in the dumpster, but the next morning, it was propped up outside my door. Last night, I had the dream again. This time, the house wasn't empty. There was something standing in the window, watching me. It was tall and thin, with long, crooked limbs and a face that was little more than a smear of shadow. Its head tilted slightly, and I felt its eyes, if it had eyes, lock onto mine. When I woke up, the painting had changed. The figure in the window was there now, perfectly rendered, its hand pressed against the glass as if trying to push through. I don't know what it wants, but tonight, when I looked out my own window, I saw the hill. It's closer. It started on an unremarkable Tuesday, the kind that feels like a placeholder in the week. I was waiting for my usual bus home, scrolling through my phone to kill time, when I noticed someone standing too close to the edge of the curb. They weren't doing anything particularly strange, just standing there, their hands stuffed into the pockets of a battered coat, staring at the street like they were waiting for something that wasn't coming. What caught my attention was the way they glanced at me. Not just a casual glance, more like they were scanning me, taking in every detail, as if I were the thing they had been waiting for. It sent a shiver up my spine, but before I could react, the bus pulled up, and we both got on. I didn't think much of it at first. Weird people take the bus all the time, but as I settled into my seat near the middle, I realized they were sitting right behind me. There were plenty of open seats, but they chose the one closest to me. I could feel their eyes on the back of my head, like static electricity prickling my skin. When I turned around to look, they smiled, a strange, off-center smile that didn't reach their eyes, and said, "You're not supposed to be here yet." I blinked, unsure if I had misheard. Before I could ask what they meant, the bus jolted, and I turned back toward the front. By the next stop, they were gone. No one else seemed to have noticed them leave. That night, I couldn't shake the unease. I kept replaying their words in my head. "You're not supposed to be here yet." What did that mean? I tried to brush it off as a random encounter with someone not all there mentally, but it didn't help. Sleep didn't come easy, and when it finally did, it felt like closing my eyes for seconds before my alarm jolted me awake. My clock said 6:30 a.m., but I could have sworn it was still the middle of the night. My body felt heavy, like I hadn't slept at all. The rest of the day was worse. Little things kept happening that didn't add up. I got on my train to work, only to realize halfway through the ride that I was heading the wrong direction, a mistake I've never made before. My phone glitched out, showing the wrong time no matter how many times I restarted it. At work, my colleague Jenna swore she had handed me a file to review that I couldn't remember receiving. But the file was on my desk when I checked, and it had my handwriting all over it like I'd already gone through it. The problem was, none of it looked familiar. The stranger wasn't far from my mind that day, but I tried not to dwell on it. By the time I left the office, I was ready to chalk everything up to stress or lack of sleep. But as I walked toward my bus stop, I saw them again. Same coat, same unsettling smile. They were sitting on the bench, waiting for me. I froze. Part of me wanted to turn around and leave, but they waved me over like they knew me. Against my better judgment, I approached. "You're still out of place," they said, their tone oddly calm, like they were stating a fact. "It's going to get worse if you don't figure it out soon." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. They tilted their head, studying me again. "It doesn't matter what I say. You won't remember this conversation anyway." Then, before I could press them further, they got up and walked away. I tried to follow, but as soon as they rounded the corner, they were gone, vanished into thin air. That night, I woke up in a cold sweat, heart pounding like I'd been running. My room looked the same, but something felt off. The shadows were too sharp, the air too still. My clock read 3:47 a.m., but my phone said 10:12 p.m. When I checked my messages, I found one from Jenna, time-stamped hours earlier, asking why I hadn't shown up to a meeting we'd both been at. I stared at it, feeling the edges of my reality fray. I had been at that meeting, or had I? The details felt slippery, like trying to hold water in my hands. Over the next few days, the glitches escalated. I would catch glimpses of the stranger in reflections, in shop windows, in puddles, even in the glass of my microwave. But when I turned around, they weren't there. Time stopped making sense. I'd leave my apartment at noon and arrive at work only to find the clock reading 9 a.m. I'd find objects in my home that didn't belong to me, a pair of old-fashioned glasses on my nightstand, a book with pages torn out, a photo of a place I didn't recognize, but that filled me with inexplicable dread. The worst part was the memories. They weren't just fading, they were warping. I started remembering conversations I never had, places I'd never been, people I'd never met. But the memories felt real, too real. I could recall the scent of the sea air, the sound of a voice calling my name, the texture of sand under my feet. But I've never lived near the ocean. One night, as I was rifling through the bizarre objects that kept appearing in my apartment, I found a note. It was written in my handwriting, but I had no memory of writing it. It said, "Stop looking. You're already part of it." I stared at the note, my hands shaking. What did it mean? What was I part of? That's when the stranger appeared again, this time in my living room. I didn't hear them come in, didn't see them move. They were just there sitting in my chair like they belonged there. "You figured it out, haven't you?" they asked, their voice softer now, almost kind. "This isn't real. It never was." "What do you mean?" I whispered, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. They leaned forward, their expression unreadable. "You're caught in a loop. A test, maybe, or a mistake. It doesn't matter. The more you notice, the less stable it becomes." I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but before I could, they reached out and touched my forehead with 2 fingers. The world shattered like glass. For a moment, I was nowhere and everywhere, floating in a void filled with fragments of my life. And then I was back, sitting on the same bus I'd taken that first day. The stranger was gone, and the world seemed normal again. But it wasn't. I know it wasn't. Every now and then, I see things, tiny glitches in the fabric of my reality. A bird frozen mid-flight, a person walking backward, my own reflection smiling when I'm not. I don't know what's real anymore. Maybe I never did. My apartment overlooked a narrow alley, the kind of lifeless gap between buildings where nothing ever happened. The only view was a blank brick wall and a few dusty windows from the building across the way. I worked late most nights, and when I wasn't working, I was sitting on my couch staring out that window, sipping cheap wine and letting my mind wander. That's why I noticed it. The window directly across from mine had always been dark. I'd never seen lights on, never spotted anyone moving around, never even saw the curtains shift. But one night, as I sat with my glass of wine, I saw the shape of a person standing there. They didn't move. I squinted, trying to make out more details, but the figure was just a shadow, a tall, indistinct form framed by the dim light spilling in from somewhere beyond the room. I told myself it was nothing. A neighbor who finally decided to show up. A trick of the light. I went to bed and forgot about it. The next night, they were there again. This time, they were closer to the window. I sat frozen, watching, waiting for them to do something. But they didn't. No wave, no sign of recognition. They just stood there staring out, or maybe staring in. I tried to convince myself they couldn't see me. My lights were off, and the glow from my laptop couldn't have been enough to make me visible. Still, my skin crawled as I slipped away from the window, pulling the curtains shut. For the next week, the figure appeared every night. Always at the same time, always in the same place. I started dreading it, refusing to look at the window. But even when I couldn't see them, I could feel them. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to take a photo. I waited until the figure appeared, then crept to the window, my phone in hand. My heart pounded as I raised the camera and snapped the picture, the faint sound of the shutter making me flinch. When I looked at the photo, the window was empty. There was no silhouette, no shadowy figure. Just the curtains, pulled back slightly to reveal the darkened room beyond. I checked again, peeking out from behind the curtains. The figure was still there, exactly where they'd been every night. But they weren't in the photo. I deleted the image and slammed the curtains shut, my chest tightening with unease. The next morning, I found something strange on my windowsill. A single piece of paper, folded in half. I didn't open the window to leave things out there, and no one else could access it unless they climbed 3 stories. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. Inside was a crude drawing of a person standing in a window. Beneath it, in scrawled handwriting, were the words, "I see you." I didn't go to work that day. I couldn't. Instead, I stayed in bed, keeping the curtains closed and every light in the apartment on. When night fell, I forced myself not to look, not to think about it. But just past midnight, I heard a tap. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each passing second. A rhythmic knock, knock, knock against the glass. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know. But something compelled me to pull back the curtain. The figure was no longer across the alley. They were standing outside my window. Their face was obscured by the darkness, but I could see their hand pressed against the glass. Fingers long and thin, almost skeletal. I stumbled back, my breath hitching, and the tapping stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from the other side of the glass, a voice whispered, "Let me in." I ran. I grabbed my keys and bolted out the door, not stopping until I was outside, the cold night air stinging my skin. I looked up at my apartment window, expecting to see the figure still standing there. But it was empty. The next morning, I went back to grab my things, determined to leave for good. But when I entered the apartment, the air was heavy, suffocating. The curtains were wide open. On the wall opposite the window, written in dark, smeared letters, were the words, "You let me in. I moved out that day. But now, every night, no matter where I am, I see them. In reflections, in shadows, in the corners of my eyes. Always watching. And I think it's only a matter of time before they find a way back in." It started innocently enough. A misplaced set of keys, a glass of water I didn't remember pouring sitting half empty on the counter. At first, I chalked it up to my schedule. Too much overtime, too little sleep. My brain had become a sieve. If I wasn't forgetting things outright, I was misremembering them, jumbling events like an old tape on fast forward. Annoying, but not alarming. Then, about a week ago, I woke up to find my phone in the freezer. It was the first thing that truly threw me. I lived alone, and I had no memory of putting it there. I couldn't even think of a scenario where I might have done it absent-mindedly. Still, I reasoned it away. Maybe I'd wandered in half asleep, carrying it while grabbing a late-night snack. Stupid, but not impossible. I let it go, even laughed about it later. The laughter stopped a few days later when I came home to find my couch moved. Not by much, just a few inches. enough that the impression it left in the carpet was visible, like someone had nudged it with their knee and forgotten to push it back. I told myself I must have bumped into it that morning. That explanation held up until I noticed the lamp next to it was turned toward the wall, the bulb throwing a strange oval of light onto the paint. That wasn't something I would have done. The next morning, my front door was unlocked. I distinctly remembered locking it before bed, sliding the bolt into place, and tugging on the handle to be sure. There were no signs of a break-in, no scratches on the lock or muddy footprints on the floor. Nothing was stolen. But for the first time, I felt a pang of unease. I'd always loved living alone, relishing the quiet, the freedom. But now, every creak of the old wood floors felt like a footstep, every distant car horn like a signal. I started triple-checking the locks. I bought a little door wedge with an alarm built in, just in case. It made me feel better for about 48 hours. Then the dreams started. The first one was vague, just an impression of someone standing in my bedroom doorway, their silhouette tall and featureless. I couldn't make out a face, but I remember the weight of their stare, heavy and suffocating, like being held underwater. I woke up drenched in sweat. The door was still closed, the wedge still in place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been watched. In the second dream, the figure was closer, standing at the foot of my bed, its presence more solid. I didn't just sense it. I felt it. The air around me seemed colder, denser, like the room itself was rejecting me. I tried to scream, to thrash, but my body wouldn't move. It wasn't until I jolted awake, gasping for air, that I realized I'd been holding my breath. When I woke up, the wedge was gone. I found it later, tucked behind a box in the hall closet. I hadn't been in that closet in weeks. My hands shook as I shoved it back under the door. I called my best friend, Sarah, and told her about the dreams. She listened, concerned but skeptical, and told me it sounded like sleep paralysis. I wanted to believe her, but the wedge. That night, I put a chair in front of the door. I stayed up late watching TV, dozing off in fits and starts. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of humming. It was faint, barely audible over the TV's low drone, but unmistakably real. A single, low note, held steady, vibrating in the air like a tuning fork. I muted the TV. The sound persisted. My heart hammered as I crept toward the door. The chair was still in place. Slowly, I peeked out into the hallway. Nothing. Just empty shadows stretching toward the kitchen. I slept with the lights on. The next day, I started noticing people. Strangers on the street, in the grocery store, on the subway. Their faces didn't stand out. They looked ordinary enough, but there was something about the way they watched me. Their gazes lingered just a beat too long. Their eyes filled with an odd intensity, as though they recognized me. I began to feel like a bug pinned to a board. It wasn't just people. Objects began to shift. My favorite mug disappeared from the cabinet, only to reappear days later on my bathroom sink. My mail ended up in the freezer. The clock on my microwave kept resetting to midnight, no matter how many times I fixed it. Small things, insignificant on their own, but together they created a patchwork of unease I couldn't ignore. The final straw came last night. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard the humming again. This time, it wasn't faint. It was loud, resonant, vibrating through my chest like a plucked string. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside me, rattling in my bones. I ran. I didn't stop until I was at Sarah's door, pounding until she answered. She let me in, bleary-eyed and worried. I told her everything, every detail, and begged her to believe me. She didn't say much, just nodded and poured me a drink. I spent the night on her couch, too afraid to close my eyes. This morning, I woke up to find my phone in the freezer. Except it wasn't my freezer. It was Sarah's. I showed it to her, my hands trembling, but she just frowned. "You put it there last night," she said. "You don't remember?" I didn't. Now I'm sitting in my apartment, every light blazing, the door bolted and wedged shut. I haven't left the couch in hours, afraid to move, afraid to blink. The microwave clock just reset again. I don't know if I'm losing my mind or if something is in here with me, playing with me, unraveling me thread by thread. I keep thinking about those strangers, their too long stares, the way their eyes followed me like they knew something I didn't. The humming has started again. This time, it's coming from inside the walls. The first time I saw the house, it wasn't there. I walked my dog, Milo, along the same route every evening. We passed the same rows of neat suburban houses, the same stretch of woods, and a vacant lot that's been empty as long as I can remember. But one night, the house was there. It was massive, looming where the empty lot should have been. Its dark wooden frame was impossibly tall, with steep gables and windows like staring eyes. It didn't look abandoned exactly, it looked paused, like someone had left in a hurry but planned to come back. Milo wouldn't go near it. He froze on the sidewalk, ears flat, growling low in his throat. I stared at the house, my skin prickling. I'd walked this route every night for months. I knew every crack in the pavement, every creaky mailbox, every yard gnome with a chipped hat. There was no way I could have missed something like this. I turned to head back the way I came, but something caught my eye, a light in one of the upstairs windows. It flickered faintly, then went out. The next morning, the house was gone. I thought maybe I'd imagined it. It was late, and I'd been stressed at work, so maybe my mind had played a trick on me. I didn't tell anyone, not even my sister, who I usually confided in about weird stuff. But a few nights later, it was back. This time, Milo refused to even step onto the sidewalk in front of the lot. He pulled at his leash, whining, until I gave up and walked a different route. The house was darker now. The windows were covered in something. It looked like frost, but it was too warm for that. The wooden boards seemed damp, as if the entire structure was sweating. And the light was back. This time, it stayed on longer, glowing faintly from the top floor. I could have sworn I saw a shadow pass in front of it. The next day, I asked around. "That lot at the corner of Cedar and Main," I said casually to my neighbor, Mrs. Patel. "There used to be an old house there, right?" She looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "No, did. That's been empty since before we moved in." "Why?" "No reason," I said, forcing a smile. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. The house came and went over the next few weeks. It wasn't always there. Sometimes, the lot was just an overgrown patch of weeds. Other times, the house loomed like it had always been there, its warped wood and dark windows daring me to look closer. And each time, Milo grew more frantic. He started barking at shadows, refusing to leave the apartment some nights. One evening, I made a decision. I would go inside. I don't know what possessed me to do it. Maybe I wanted answers. Maybe I wanted proof that I wasn't losing my mind. The house was there when I arrived, darker and more imposing than ever. The front door hung slightly ajar, as if waiting for me. I tied Milo's leash to a lamppost. He howled in protest, but I couldn't bring him with me. "Stay here, buddy," I whispered, stroking his head. The air grew colder as I stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked under my weight, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Inside, the house was suffocatingly quiet. The air smelled of damp wood and something faintly metallic. The walls were lined with old, faded wallpaper that curled at the edges. Furniture was scattered haphazardly, chairs overturned, a sofa with its stuffing spilling out. But there was something else. The walls moved. It was subtle at first, like a faint ripple in water. But the longer I stared, the more I realized the wallpaper wasn't peeling. It was shifting, undulating, like it was alive. A noise broke the silence, a faint, rhythmic creaking, like footsteps coming from upstairs. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. Against every instinct, I climbed the stairs. The creaking grew louder with each step, the wood groaning beneath my feet. At the top of the stairs was a long hallway, lined with closed doors. The light I'd seen from outside was coming from the last door on the left. It flickered faintly, casting strange shadows on the walls. I walked toward it, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. Inside was a room unlike the rest of the house. It was pristine, untouched by time or decay. A single chair sat in the center, facing a large mirror. And in the chair was me, not my reflection. Me. The figure sat motionless, staring into the mirror. Its face was identical to mine, but its expression was blank, its eyes unblinking, its lips slightly parted. My heart pounded as I stepped closer. The figure turned to look at me. "You shouldn't have come here," it said in my voice. I stumbled back, tripping over the doorframe. The figure stood, its movements slow and deliberate. "You were supposed to stay outside," it continued, stepping closer. I scrambled to my feet, running back down the hallway. The walls pulsed around me, the house groaning like a living thing. By the time I reached the front door, the air was so thick I could barely breathe. Milo was barking furiously outside, straining against his leash. The moment I stepped out, the house let out a deep, guttural sound, like a dying animal, and collapsed in on itself. When I looked back, the lot was empty again. I don't walk that route anymore. But last night, I saw the house in my dreams. And this time, it wasn't alone. It brought the others. I was driving back from a work trip late at night, cruising down a nearly deserted stretch of highway. The only light came from my headlights and the occasional glow of distant farmhouses. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the darkness felt endless. I was halfway through a playlist when the signal cut out, replaced by static. Annoyed, I reached for the dial, twisting it to find another station. That's when I heard it. A voice. It was faint at first, buried under the crackle of static, but it grew clearer as I tuned in. A woman's voice, low and calm, speaking directly into the void of the night. "If you're listening, you're on the right road. Keep going." I froze, my hand hovering over the dial. "Don't stop now," she continued, her tone smooth and steady. "It's not safe to turn back." The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. It was probably a late-night talk show or some kind of creative program, I told myself. But something about the way she spoke felt wrong. Too deliberate, too intimate. I left the radio on, curiosity winning over unease. "For those of you out there tonight, driving alone," the woman said, her voice softening, "you should know that you're not really alone." I glanced at the empty highway stretching ahead of me, my pulse quickening. "You're being followed," she said. I nearly swerved off the road. My eyes darted to the rear-view mirror, but the road behind me was empty, just darkness stretching back forever. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the creeping fear. It was a prank, I told myself. Some over-the-top radio drama designed to spook late-night drivers. But then the voice changed. It wasn't smooth and calm anymore. It was urgent, frantic. "Don't look back," she said sharply. "No matter what you hear. Don't look back." The static flared, drowning out her words, and for a moment, the car was filled with nothing but white noise. Then the sound shifted. It wasn't static anymore. It was a faint scratching noise, like nails dragging against metal. I turned the radio off, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. The scratching didn't stop. It was coming from behind me. My throat tightened as I glanced at the rear-view mirror again. Still nothing. Just empty seats and darkness beyond the back window. But the sound grew louder, more insistent, as if something was clawing its way closer. I pressed down on the gas, the engine roaring as the car sped forward. My eyes flicked back to the road, my heart hammering in my chest. And then I heard it, a low, guttural whisper coming from right behind me. "Why are you running?" I screamed, nearly losing control of the car. My headlights caught a sign on the side of the road, an exit coming up in half a mile. Without thinking, I veered toward it, desperate to get off the highway. The road twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the woods. The trees closed in around me, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. I finally pulled over, my hands shaking as I killed the engine. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing. For a moment, I thought I was safe. Then I saw it. In the rearview mirror, just for a second, a flash of movement. A shadow, dark and twisted, flitting across the back seat. I spun around, but the car was empty. The scratching started again, this time from outside the car. Slow and deliberate, circling around me. I locked the doors, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely think. The radio turned itself back on. The woman's voice was calm again, almost amused. "You shouldn't have stopped," she said. The static swallowed her words, and the headlights flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows across the trees. Something slammed against the back of the car, hard enough to make it rock. I didn't wait to see what it was. I started the engine and tore out of there, my tires skidding on the dirt road. I didn't care where I was going. I just wanted to be as far from that place as possible. The scratching and whispers faded the faster I drove, until finally, I was alone with the sound of the engine and the hum of the tires on the road. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station hours later, the sun just beginning to rise. The attendant gave me a strange look as I stumbled inside, still shaking. "Rough night?" he asked. "You could say that," I muttered, glancing back at my car. That's when I saw it. A single, long scratch ran down the length of the car, deep and jagged, like something had raked claws across the metal. I don't drive at night anymore, and I never ever turn on the radio. It was supposed to be a simple errand, a late-night run to pick up my friend Jen from a party on the far side of town. She texted me earlier, saying her ride had bailed, and I, being the reliable friend I am, agreed to swing by. The party was at an old farmhouse down a lonely stretch of road, surrounded by endless fields of tall grass that swayed eerily in the wind. The kind of place where phone signals vanish and your headlights barely penetrate the darkness. When I pulled up, the house was completely dark. No music, no laughter, no signs of a party at all. Just an empty gravel driveway and the sound of cicadas buzzing in the still night air. "It texted am here. Where are you?" No response. I waited, tapping my fingers on the steering wheel, the unease creeping in. The house loomed ahead, its broken shutters hanging at odd angles, like it was leaning forward to watch me. Then my phone buzzed. A text from Jen. "Come inside. Front door's open." Something about it felt off. Jen hated creepy old places, and this house looked like the set of a bad horror movie. I texted her back. "Why can't you come out? I'm parked out front." The dots appeared, indicating she was typing, then vanished. No reply. I sighed, grabbing my phone and stepping out of the car. The air was colder than I expected, the wind carrying the faint scent of mildew and something metallic. The front door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a pitch-black interior. "Yen?" I called, my voice echoing unnaturally. No answer. I flicked on my phone's flashlight and stepped inside. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and the walls were bare except for patches of peeling wallpaper. The air felt wrong, thick, like the house was holding its breath. "Yen?" I called again, moving deeper into the house. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were faint, dusty prints leading from the front door into the hallway, too small to be mine. I followed them hesitantly, my flashlight beam trembling as I moved. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, the end disappearing into shadow. Halfway down, I heard it, a faint whisper. "Over here!" It was Jen's voice, unmistakable, but it sounded strange, off, like it was coming from a bad recording. I stopped, heart hammering, and shone my light toward the sound. At the end of the hallway was a door, slightly ajar. The footprints led straight to it. "Yen?" I called, my voice shaking. "Come here," the voice repeated, softer this time. I swallowed hard and approached the door. As I reached out to push it open, a loud thud came from behind me. I whipped around, the flashlight beam darting over the empty hallway. Nothing. When I turned back to the door, it was fully open. The room beyond was small and empty, except for a single chair in the center. On the chair sat a phone, its screen glowing faintly. My phone. I froze, patting my pocket where I'd put it minutes ago. It was gone. I stepped into the room, my legs moving on autopilot. The air was colder here, biting at my skin. I picked up the phone, and the screen lit up with a single notification, one new message. I opened it. "Don't turn around." Every hair on my body stood on end. My breath caught in my throat as the room seemed to grow darker. I could feel it, something behind me, watching, waiting. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The silence was deafening. Then a soft giggle right next to my ear. I bolted. I didn't look back. I ran down the hallway, through the front door, and straight to my car. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the gravel driveway. the house shrinking in my rearview mirror. My phone buzzed again as I reached the main road. A text from Jen. "Where are you?" "Still waiting at the party." I slammed on the brakes, my hands trembling as I stared at the message. I didn't respond. I didn't go back. The next morning, Jen texted me again, asking why I'd bailed. When I told her what happened, she swore the party had been crowded all night, music blasting until the early hours. I drove by the farmhouse the next day. It wasn't there, just an empty field of swaying grass and a gravel driveway that led nowhere. I'd been driving back from a work trip, hours behind schedule thanks to a storm that had turned the highway into a mess of red brake lights and blaring horns. When I saw the small green sign for an alternate route, I didn't think twice. County Road 57, next right. It sounded like salvation, a quiet back road that would cut through the woods and save me an hour. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the wipers squeaking faintly across the windshield as I turned onto the narrow road. My GPS recalculated, its flat voice assuring me that the detour would work. "Turn left in 3.7 miles, it said. I didn't make it 3.7 miles. The road was darker than I'd expected, the trees on either side growing so thick they formed a tunnel, their branches clawing at the edges of my headlights. I rolled down the window to let in some air, but the woods were eerily silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just the low hum of my engine. Then, up ahead, I saw the house. It sat just off the road, its outline barely visible through the trees. The porch light was on, a warm yellow glow spilling onto the overgrown grass. There was something odd about it, like it didn't belong there. The GPS crackled. I glanced down at the screen, frowning. It wasn't supposed to crackle. It wasn't a radio. The glowing map blinked once, twice, then the screen went black. "Great," I muttered, pulling over in front of the house to fiddle with it. As soon as I stopped, the porch light flickered. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. I told myself it was just an electrical issue, maybe a loose bulb, but something about it felt deliberate. Then the light went out completely. I turned the key in the ignition, but the car didn't start. The engine clicked once, then fell silent. My headlights dimmed, and for a moment, the world was pitch black. When the lights came back on, someone was standing in the road. I didn't see them approach, didn't hear a single footstep. They were just there, a tall figure wrapped in a dark coat, their face hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat. I locked the doors without thinking, my fingers fumbling on the button. The figure didn't move. "Hey!" I called out, my voice shaking slightly. "Do you need help?" The figure tilted its head, just a fraction, as if considering me. Then, slowly it raised one arm and pointed. "At the house." "No thanks," I muttered, turning back to the car. I twisted the key again, harder this time, willing the engine to catch. It sputtered, groaned, and finally roared to life. Relief flooded through me, and I shifted into reverse, ready to get the hell out of there. The figure was gone. I didn't see where they went. They didn't walk away. I would have heard it. They just vanished. The house's porch light flickered back on. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I found myself staring at the light. There was something wrong about the house, something that made my chest tighten and my thoughts grow foggy. I didn't want to go inside, but I didn't want to stay in the car either. The engine cut off again. This time, the radio came to life, even though I hadn't touched it. A low, crackling voice filled the car, speaking words I couldn't understand. The language was harsh, guttural, like the sound of rocks grinding together. The static grew louder. I couldn't breathe. The door handle was cold under my fingers as I stepped out of the car, the humid air pressing against my skin. My feet moved on their own, carrying me toward the house. The door opened before I reached it. The inside was impossibly dark, the warm light from the porch unable to penetrate the doorway. I stood there, frozen, as a faint sound drifted out, a whisper, soft and rhythmic, like someone chanting in the distance. "Hello!" I called, my voice trembling. The whispering stopped. Then from the shadows, something moved. It was fast, too fast for me to see clearly, but I felt it. A rush of air, a presence brushing past me. The door slammed shut, and the porch light went out again. I ran back to the car, fumbling with the keys as the darkness around me seemed to grow thicker. The engine roared to life, and I didn't look back as I sped down the road, my tires kicking up gravel. The GPS came back on as I hit the main highway. The screen was blank except for one word, flashing in bold letters. Don't! I never found County Road 57 again. It's not on any map, and no one I've talked to has ever heard of it. But sometimes when I drive at night, I see the house again. Just for a moment, its warm light glowing faintly through the trees. And I know it's waiting for me to come back. The radio crackled faintly, the kind of static that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the storm raging outside. I hadn't intended to stop at the roadside diner, but the rain was coming down so hard I couldn't see the edges of the road. Its neon sign buzzed and flickered, casting faint red light over the empty parking lot. Ethel's open 24 hours. The Inn Ethel was hanging crookedly, threatening to go out altogether. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee and grease, the sort of smell that clung to you even after you left. A waitress leaned against the counter, her hair tied up in a messy bun, her face illuminated by the pale glow of a cracked phone screen. She didn't look up when I walked in. I chose a booth near the window, the vinyl seat squeaking as I sat down. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the rows of empty booths and tables. The only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights and the faint hiss of rain against the glass. A menu was already on the table, sticky with smudged fingerprints. I wasn't hungry, but I felt obligated to order something, so I settled on coffee. The waitress appeared at my table without a word, setting down a chipped mug and pouring a stream of black liquid that smelled more like burnt toast than caffeine. Her name tag read Lila, and when she finally glanced at me, her eyes seemed to linger just a second too long. "Rough night?" she asked, her voice flat but not unkind. "Something like that," I said, taking a cautious sip. She nodded, like she knew more than she was letting on, and returned to the counter. I was halfway through the coffee when the door swung open, letting in a gust of cold air and a man in a long, dripping coat. He stood in the doorway for a moment, surveying the diner with a strange intensity before making his way to a booth at the opposite end of the room. Lila followed him with her eyes, her hand frozen mid-swipe across the counter. The man sat down, removing his coat to reveal a black suit that looked entirely out of place in a diner like this. His movements were deliberate, almost too smooth, and when he looked up, his gaze met mine across the room. I immediately looked away, the intensity of his stare making my skin crawl. Lila approached his table, her posture stiff, her steps hesitant. She didn't bother with a menu or pleasantries. The two exchanged a few words I couldn't hear, and then she hurried back behind the counter. I tried to focus on my coffee, on the storm outside, on anything but the man, but I could feel his presence, like an unseen weight pressing against me. "Don't mind him," Lila said suddenly, startling me. She was standing by my table, her voice low. "He's just passing through." "Who is he?" I asked. She shook her head. "No one you want to know." The lights flickered then, the hum of the fluorescents stuttering. The radio crackled again, a faint voice breaking through the static before dissolving back into nothing. When the lights steadied, the man was standing. He hadn't been holding anything when he walked in, but now he carried a small leather satchel, its surface worn and scuffed. He crossed the diner with the same deliberate grace, stopping at my table. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, his voice smooth and deep. I didn't answer right away, my throat suddenly dry. He didn't wait for permission, sliding into the booth across from me. "You've been driving for hours," he said, his tone casual, as if we were old friends. "It's dangerous in weather like this." "How do you know that?" He smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth curling in a way that felt more predatory than friendly. "I know a lot of things," he said, placing the satchel on the table. The diner seemed quieter now, the storm outside muffled. Lila was nowhere to be seen, though I hadn't noticed her leave. The man unbuckled the satchel, pulling out a small, wooden box. It looked ancient, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. "Do you believe in choices?" he asked, running a finger along the edge of the box. "What kind of choices?" "The kind that define a life." The kind that make everything before and after seem trivial. I didn't know how to respond, so I stayed silent. He pushed the box toward me. Open it. My pulse quickened. Why? Because inside is the answer to the question you haven't asked yet. I stared at the box, its surface warm to the touch. The symbol seemed to shift under my fingertips, forming patterns that I couldn't quite make sense of. What happens if I don't open it? He leaned back, his smile widening. Then you'll finish your coffee, pay your bill, and leave. And nothing will change. The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. I lifted the lid. Inside was a single object, a coin. Its surface was polished to a mirror shine, one side engraved with the image of an open door, the other blank. What is this? I asked, holding it up. It's a token, he said. One use, one door. It will take you anywhere you've ever wanted to go, but only once. The room felt colder, the air around me charged. Anywhere, anywhere, he repeated. A place you lost, a moment you missed, a life you dreamed of but never lived. Flip the coin, and the door will appear. My heart raced, 1,000 possibilities flooding my mind. But there was something he wasn't saying. I could see it in the way his smile faltered, just slightly. What's the catch? His gaze darkened, the gold in his eyes dulling. You can only step through if you leave something behind. The coin chooses what. My hands trembled as I set the coin back in the box. And if I don't use it? He shrugged, his smile returning. Then you keep it, a promise, or a regret, depending on what you decide. The lights flickered again, and when they steadied, he was gone. The box sat alone on the table, the coin gleaming faintly in the dim light. I glanced toward the counter, where Lila stood, her expression unreadable. You should leave it, she said softly. But I didn't. When I stepped back into the storm, the box was in my pocket, its weight heavier than it should have been. And somewhere deep inside me, I knew I'd already made my choice. It started with a sound I couldn't explain. I just moved into a new house, a fixer-upper on the edge of a small, quiet town. The kind of place where neighbors waved from their porches and the air smelled like freshly cut grass. I was excited for a fresh start, though the house itself needed some work. It was the kind of old, creaky house where noises were part of the charm. At first, I blamed the sound on that, the groaning pipes, the settling foundation. It was faint at first, almost melodic, a series of soft clicks that reminded me of typing. I heard it for the first time late one night, sitting in the living room with a glass of wine and a book. The sound came from somewhere upstairs, distant but distinct. I froze, holding my breath, trying to pinpoint it. It stopped. I told myself it was nothing, a branch brushing against a window, or the house doing what old houses do. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't normal. The next night, I heard it again. This time, I was in bed, just about to fall asleep, when the clicks began. They were sharper now, more deliberate, like someone tapping on glass with their fingernails. It was coming from the guest room. I hesitated before getting up, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. Slowly, I made my way down the hall, the floorboards groaning under my weight. When I reached the guest room door, the clicking stopped. The room was empty, just as I'd left it. Bare walls, a few moving boxes I hadn't unpacked yet, and a dusty old mirror propped against one corner. The mirror had come with the house, a heavy, antique thing with an ornate gold frame. I didn't like it much, but I hadn't gotten around to moving it. As I stood there, staring into the darkened room, something about the mirror caught my eye. The glass seemed off. It wasn't the faint layer of dust or the way the light from the hallway reflected in it. It was the way the reflection didn't quite match the room. I leaned closer, squinting. In the mirror, the boxes were shifted slightly, like someone had been rifling through them. The curtains on the window were drawn, though they were open in real life. And then I saw it, a figure standing just behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Moving was stressful, and old houses were creepy. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. That evening, as the sun set, I decided to get rid of the mirror. I dragged it down the stairs and out to the garage, wedging it behind a stack of boxes where I wouldn't have to look at it. That night, the clicking started again. louder this time, more frantic. I lay in bed, clutching the covers, too afraid to move. The sound seemed to echo through the house, sharp and insistent, like it wanted me to hear. And then just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I sat up, straining to listen, when I heard something new. A whisper. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. A low, guttural voice, speaking words I couldn't understand. It came from the hallway outside my bedroom. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, my hands shaking. The beam of light swept across the dark hallway, illuminating nothing but the worn hardwood floor and peeling wallpaper. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. The whisper stopped. For a moment, there was silence. And then, from the garage, I heard a single, deafening crash. I rushed downstairs, my heart hammering. The garage door was ajar, the light inside flickering faintly. When I stepped inside, the mirror was shattered. The shards lay scattered across the floor, glittering in the dim light. But as I moved closer, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The pieces of glass were still reflecting the room, but not the one I was standing in. In the shards, I saw a dark, empty space, its walls covered in strange, claw-like marks. And in the largest piece, I saw a face. It wasn't mine. The eyes were hollow, the mouth twisted into a cruel, unnatural grin. As I stared, the face moved, leaning closer, pressing against the surface of the glass like it was trying to break through. I backed away, my breath coming in short, panic gasps. That was when I noticed the whispers had started again. They weren't coming from the mirror this time. They were behind me. I ran. I grabbed my car keys and drove, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away. I haven't been back to the house since. I don't know what was in that mirror, and I don't want to know. But sometimes late at night, I still hear it, the clicking, faint and rhythmic, like it's waiting for me to come back. I don't think it will wait much longer. I live alone in a studio apartment, the kind of place where the walls are thin and the neighbors' arguments blend with late-night TV. I've always liked the noise. Silence feels too empty. That's why I leave the TV on at night, even when I'm not watching it. It hums in the background, a steady rhythm that keeps me company. But last week, the static started. It was around midnight when I first noticed. I was scrolling through my phone, half listening to a rerun of some crime drama, when the picture on the TV flickered. For a split second, the screen went gray, crackling with static before cutting back to the show. I figured it was a glitch. Old cable lines, maybe. But then it happened again, and this time the static lasted longer. And there was something in it. At first, I thought it was just an artifact of the distortion, shadows or patterns created by the interference. But as I watched, the shapes began to coalesce. They weren't random. They were deliberate. A face. It was faint, just an outline at first, but as the static hissed and popped, the face became clearer. It wasn't human, not entirely. The features were stretched, warped, as if someone had pulled the image like taffy. The eyes were too wide, too dark, and they stared straight at me. Then the static disappeared, and the show came back on. I sat there, frozen, the remote still in my hand. My brain scrambled for an explanation. Maybe I was tired. Maybe it was a trick of the light or a fault in the cable. But as I stared at the TV, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been looking back at me. The next night, it happened again. This time, the static lasted longer. The face appeared almost immediately, clearer than before, and as I watched, it moved. Its head tilted slightly, as if curious, and its mouth opened. The static hissed louder, drowning out the sound of the show, and I swear I heard something underneath it. A voice, faint and distorted. "Can you see me?" I turned the TV off. I didn't sleep that night. Over the next few days, things got worse. The static started showing up at random times, during the morning news, while I was cooking, even in the middle of the afternoon when the TV was off. Yes, off. I'd be sitting on the couch, reading or scrolling through my phone, when the screen would flicker to life, gray and crackling. The face would appear, staring at me, its expression unreadable. And each time, the voice grew louder. "Can you see me now?" I stopped using the TV. I unplugged it, shoved it in a closet, and tried to forget about it. But the static followed me. It showed up on my laptop, cutting into YouTube videos and Zoom calls. It hijacked my phone screen, the face flickering in and out between apps. Once, I even saw it in the reflection of my bathroom mirror, a faint distortion hovering over my shoulder. I started noticing other things, too. Shadows that didn't belong to anything. Faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. My apartment felt different, like the air was thicker, heavier. I wasn't alone. Last night, the static returned, louder and clearer than ever. This time, it wasn't just on the screen, it was everywhere. The TV, my laptop, my phone. Even the overhead light buzzed with the same erratic crackle, casting flickering shadows that danced across the walls. The face appeared again, but it wasn't confined to the screen anymore. It hovered in the air, a faint, ghostly outline that shimmered like heat waves. "Let me in." The voice was clear now, no longer distorted. It was soft, almost pleading, but there was something underneath it, something cold and hungry. I tried to run. I grabbed my keys, bolted for the door, but the lock wouldn't budge. The air grew colder, and the static grew louder, filling the room like a roar. "Let me in." I don't know what happened next. One moment I was pounding on the door, screaming for help, and the next I was waking up on the floor. The apartment was silent. The TV was back in its place, plugged in and turned off. My laptop and phone sat on the coffee table, perfectly still. Everything looked normal, but it didn't feel normal. The air was wrong, heavy and still, and when I turned to look at the TV, I saw my reflection in the dark screen. Except it wasn't my reflection. The face stared back at me, its two wide eyes unblinking, its mouth curved into a slow, knowing smile. And when I turned away from the screen, the smile stayed. I first noticed something was wrong when the music stopped playing. It was late. One of those nights where the world outside feels muffled, like it's holding its breath. I was working on my laptop, a playlist humming softly in the background to keep me company. And then, silence. At first, I thought the Wi-Fi had cut out, but when I checked, the connection was fine. My phone was still streaming, the progress bar moving like everything was normal, but there was no sound. Not even static. I restarted the app, but the silence remained. Then the whispers began. Faint at first, so faint I thought it was my imagination. They didn't come from the phone or the speakers, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere inside. "Do you hear it?" I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. The voice was soft, almost soothing, but it carried a weight that made my skin crawl. "Hello?" I called out, my own voice cracking. The room felt wrong, too still. The kind of stillness that makes you hyper-aware of every breath, every heartbeat. And then I saw the notification. It wasn't from the music app. It wasn't from anything I recognized. "Would you like to continue?" My stomach tightened. The words pulsed faintly on the screen, the letters too sharp, too precise. I hovered over the notification, debating whether to click it, when the whispers grew louder. "It's listening." I slammed the laptop shut, my pulse hammering in my ears. The whispers stopped immediately, leaving the room in a suffocating silence. I told myself it was stress, a weird auditory hallucination, too many late nights staring at screens. But the feeling lingered, a heavy presence just out of sight. The next day, things got stranger. When I woke up, my laptop was open on the desk. I didn't remember leaving it like that. The screen was on, the cursor blinking in a blank document. And there was another notification. "Please confirm your choice." I shut it off without looking further. At work, my computer began acting up. Files I didn't recognize started appearing on my desktop. Folders with strange names like Echo_1 and Repeat_3. When I opened them, they were empty. My co-workers didn't seem to notice anything unusual. I asked Kyle, the guy in IT, if he could check my system for malware. He just shrugged. "Everything looks fine on our end," he said. "Maybe you're downloading stuff without realizing it." I wasn't. That night, I stayed up late, scrolling through forums and tech blogs, searching for answers. A post on an obscure subreddit caught my eye. "Has anyone heard the whispers? It's not in your head." The thread was filled with similar stories. Music cutting out, notifications that didn't make sense, voices that spoke from nowhere, saying things no one should know. And then there was a comment near the bottom that made my stomach drop. "Don't answer the question. It's how they find you." I didn't sleep. The next morning, there was a new folder on my desktop. This one wasn't empty. Inside was a single audio file, titled .mp3. I stared at it for a long time, my finger hovering over the trackpad. Finally, I clicked it. The file was silent at first. Then, faintly, I heard the whisper again. "We're waiting." The voice sent chills down my spine. It was layered, as though multiple people were speaking at once, their words blending together into something both familiar and alien. And then, just before the file ended, I heard my name, not just my name, my voice. I slammed the laptop shut, my hands trembling. I tried to unplug everything that night. The laptop, the router, even my phone. I thought if I disconnected, I could stop it. But when I looked at my phone, there was a new notification waiting for me. "Would you like to proceed?" My reflection in the black screen didn't look right. The whispers didn't stop after that. They followed me everywhere. In the hum of the fridge, the rustle of leaves, even the silence between my own breaths. At work, Cal asked me if I was feeling okay. "You've been different," he said, his tone cautious. I wanted to tell him everything, about the whispers, the files, the questions. But when I opened my mouth, the words wouldn't come. That night, the final notification appeared, proceeding with or without consent. The screen flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw a face. Not mine, something hollow and sharp, its features shifting too quickly to comprehend. The whispers grew louder, filling my head, overlapping into a deafening roar. And then silence. When I woke up, everything was normal. My laptop was fine, the files were gone, my phone didn't buzz with strange notifications. Even the whispers had stopped. But the world feels different now. The colors are too bright, the sounds too sharp. People I've known for years don't seem quite right, like actors in a play who've forgotten their lines. And sometimes, when I glance at my reflection, it doesn't move with me. I don't think I'm alone in my head anymore. I wasn't supposed to go to the auction. My best friend Jess had begged me to come with her. "It'll be fun," she said. "A creepy old estate sale? That's Halloween vibes in July." I reluctantly agreed, mostly because Jess had a talent for dragging me into weird situations that somehow always turned out to be memorable. The house itself was something out of a Gothic novel. Tall, narrow, and dark, with gables that seemed to pierce the overcast sky. It belonged to some eccentric recluse who had died without an heir, and the town was selling off the contents to settle debts. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of dust and decay. A handful of other people milled around, peering at antique furniture, tarnished silverware, and faded paintings. Jess was in her element, bouncing from one oddity to the next. That's when I saw it. A mirror. It was leaning against the wall, almost hidden behind a cracked wardrobe. The frame was ornate, carved from dark wood and inlaid with what looked like ivory. The glass itself was flawless, gleaming despite the dim light in the room. But what caught my attention wasn't the craftsmanship. It was the reflection. The room in the mirror looked different, subtly so, but enough to notice. The wallpaper was cleaner, the furniture less worn, and the light coming through the windows was brighter, warmer. And then there was the woman. She stood just behind me in the reflection, her face pale and blurred, like a smudge on the glass. I spun around, my heart racing, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, she was gone. Creepy, right? Jess's voice made me jump. She had materialized beside me, grinning. "Yeah," I muttered, trying to shake the unease. "Buy it," she said, nudging me. "No way. Come on, it'd look amazing in your apartment. And it's totally haunted. Look at it." I rolled my eyes, but ended up bidding on it anyway. The auctioneer barely paid attention as I raised my hand, and I got the mirror for almost nothing. "I can't believe you actually bought it," Jess teased as we loaded it into my car. "I can't believe you talked me into it," I shot back. That night, I set the mirror up in my living room, leaning it against the wall while I figured out where to hang it. It didn't feel like it belonged there, or anywhere really, but I ignored the nagging feeling and went to bed. That's when the dreams started. In the first one, I was standing in my living room, staring at the mirror. Except it wasn't my living room. It was the room I'd seen in the reflection at the estate sale. cleaner, brighter, and somehow wrong. The woman was there again, standing just out of reach, her face obscured by shadows. She didn't move, didn't speak, but her presence pressed on me, heavy and suffocating. When I woke up, I was still staring at the mirror, standing in front of it with no memory of getting out of bed. The second night was worse. This time, the woman's face was clearer. Her eyes were dark, too large for her face, and her mouth stretched into a crooked smile that didn't reach them. She reached for me. I woke up gasping, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. The mirror had moved. It was no longer against the wall, but propped up in the middle of the living room, tilted at an angle that faced my bedroom door. I called Jess the next morning, my voice shaking as I told her what had happened. "You're freaking yourself out," she said, though she sounded less confident than usual. "It's just an old mirror. Probably shifted when you bumped it or something. Come over tonight," I said. "Please." She agreed, but she was late as always. When she finally arrived, she found me sitting on the couch, staring at the mirror. "Okay, this thing is creepy," she admitted, stepping closer to inspect it. "Do you see anything weird?" I asked. Jess tilted her head, her brow furrowing. No, just my reflection." I stood next to her and looked into the mirror. The reflection was wrong again. Jess was there, but her face didn't match her expression. In the glass, she wasn't frowning. She was smiling, wide and unnatural, her teeth bared like a predator's. "Do you see that?" I whispered. "See what?" she asked, glancing at me in confusion. Her reflection winked. I screamed, stumbling backward and dragging Jess with me. What's wrong?" she shouted. The mirror began to hum, a low, vibrating sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The glass shimmered, rippling like water. And then the woman stepped out. She moved slowly, unnaturally, her joints bending in ways that didn't seem possible. Her eyes locked onto mine, and her smile widened. Jess was frozen, her eyes wide with terror. "Run!" I shouted, shoving her toward the door. The woman lunged. We barely made it out, slamming the door behind us. The last thing I saw before we fled was the woman standing in the middle of my living room, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, watching us leave. I don't know what happened to the mirror. When I came back with a locksmith and a handful of friends the next day, the apartment was empty. No mirror, no woman, just the faint, lingering smell of something burnt. I moved out that week. Jess refuses to talk about what we saw. Sometimes, though, I catch her staring at reflections a little too long. And sometimes, when I look into my own, I swear I see her reflection smile before mine does. I found it wedged under my apartment door one evening. The envelope thick and yellowed, the edges worn like it had traveled a long way to get to me. There was no return address, no postage, just my name written in looping, elegant handwriting that looked oddly familiar, but entirely unplaceable. I stood there for a moment, staring at it, before curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a single card, its surface embossed with gold filigree, and a message written in the same script. "You are cordially invited to an evening at the house without end. Midnight. Wear red. No address, no instructions, nothing. Just those words. I should have ignored it, tossed it in the trash, and gone about my life. But there was something magnetic about the card, a pull I couldn't explain. And maybe, just maybe, I was desperate for something, anything that felt like it mattered. So at 11:30 p.m., I found myself standing in front of my closet, rifling through hangers for anything remotely red. I settled on a dress that I'd never had the nerve to wear, its crimson fabric catching the light like liquid flame. I didn't know where I was going, but somehow my feet seemed to. The city was alive with its usual late-night chaos. Blaring horns, distant laughter, the hum of streetlights. But as I walked, the noise began to fade, replaced by a strange, rhythmic sound. A soft thrum, 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 like a heartbeat, growing louder the farther I went. I turned a corner, and there it was. The house stood at the end of a narrow street that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. Its facade was dark and unassuming, its windows shuttered, but the door was open, spilling warm, golden light onto the cobblestones. Above the doorframe, in delicate iron letters, were the words, "House without end." I hesitated, my pulse quickening. This was insane. I didn't know who had invited me or why, and every instinct screamed at me to turn back. But the pull was stronger, a whisper in the back of my mind urging me forward. I stepped inside. The air shifted immediately, heavy with the scent of incense and something sweeter. Honeysuckle, maybe. The entryway was grand but strange, its walls lined with mirrors that reflected not just my image but the faint flicker of movement, as though the house was alive. "Welcome." The voice came from behind me, smooth and rich, like honey poured over velvet. I turned to see a man standing there, his suit impeccably tailored, his smile sharp and almost predatory. His eyes glinted like molten gold, catching the light in a way that made it hard to look away. "You've accepted the invitation," he said, gesturing to the room beyond. "Very few do." "I don't even know what this is," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. His smile widened. "It's exactly what you need it to be." Before I could ask what that meant, he turned and walked into the next room. I followed. The space opened into a ballroom, its ceiling impossibly high, the chandeliers dripping with crystals that shimmered like stars. People moved through the room, their faces partially obscured by elaborate masks, their laughter mingling with the soft strains of music that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. And every single one of them was wearing red. A waiter appeared at my side, offering a glass of something dark and sparkling. I took it, my fingers brushing against the cool stem of the glass, and sipped. The taste was like nothing I'd ever experienced, rich and heady, with a sweetness that lingered on my tongue. "Enjoying yourself?" The man from before was suddenly beside me again, his presence overwhelming in a way I couldn't quite explain. "I don't even know what's happening," I admitted, my gaze darting around the room. He chuckled, a low, resonant sound. "The house is a place for possibilities, for moments that haven't yet been written. You're here because you needed to see them." "See what?" He gestured toward the far side of the room, where a door stood slightly ajar, its frame glowing faintly. "Through there," he said. "You'll find what you came for." I hesitated. The crowd around me was a blur of color and sound, their movements hypnotic, but the pull toward the door was stronger. Without a word, I set down my glass and walked toward it. The hallway beyond the door was narrow, the walls covered in black and white photographs. As I passed, I realized they were of me, moments I recognized, some I'd forgotten, and others that had never happened. There I was at age 6, holding a trophy I'd never won. At 18, laughing with friends I'd never met. At 30, standing at the edge of a cliff, the ocean roaring beneath me, though I'd never lived near the sea. The last photograph stopped me in my tracks. It showed me in the present, standing in front of a large, ornate door, its surface carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift when I looked at them too long. As if on cue, the hallway ended, and there was the door from the photograph. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle. The moment I touched it, the air around me seemed to shatter, and I was somewhere else. I stood in a vast, open space, the ground beneath me smooth and reflective, like polished obsidian. Above me, the sky churned with colors I couldn't name, and in the distance, faint shapes moved, figures that were human but not. A voice echoed around me, soft and familiar. "This is the crossroads." I turned to see the man again, his golden eyes burning brighter now. "You've seen the possibilities," he said. "Now you choose. The life you've lived or the life you've only imagined." I thought about the photographs, the moments I'd seen, the joy, the pain, the version of myself I'd never been but desperately wanted to know. "What happens if I choose wrong?" I asked. He smiled, and for the first time it was almost gentle. "There is no wrong choice, only a path." The sky above me shifted, and the ground beneath my feet rippled like water. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. I wasn't supposed to be there that night. My girlfriend, Alyssa, and I had just broken up, and I was drowning my sorrows with cheap whiskey and terrible TV when my best friend, Marcus, texted me. "You up? Need a hand with something." Marcus was the type who never asked for help unless he absolutely needed it. Curious, and admittedly bored. I threw on a jacket and headed to the address he sent me. It turned out to be an old, rundown house on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where even the weeds looked dead. I parked next to his beat-up truck and immediately regretted coming. "What is this place?" I asked when he met me at the front porch, flashlight in hand. "An opportunity," he said with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "The guy who owns it paid me to clear it out. Apparently, he inherited it and wants it gone. Easy money." I frowned. "And you dragged me here because—" Marcus scratched the back of his neck. "Well, I figured you could use the distraction. Plus, this place is weird." "Weird how?" He shrugged, avoiding my gaze. "Just stick with me. You'll see." The moment we stepped inside, I understood what he meant. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and it smelled faintly of something rotten. The house had clearly been abandoned for years. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling like tattered curtains. But what struck me most was the quiet. Not the normal kind of quiet you'd expect in an old house, but a deep, unnatural silence that seemed to swallow every sound. "All right, let's split up," Marcus said, handing me a flashlight. "Just check the rooms and make sure there's nothing valuable left behind. The guy said we could keep anything we find." I hesitated. "Maybe we should stick together?" Marcus rolled his eyes. "What's the worst that could happen? It's just an old house, man. Come on." Reluctantly, I agreed, and we went our separate ways. I started upstairs, the floorboards groaning under my weight with every step. The rooms were mostly empty, filled with nothing but broken furniture and peeling wallpaper. I was about to call it a night when I found the door. It was at the end of the hallway, barely visible behind a tattered curtain. Unlike the other doors, which were plain and wooden, this one was metal, with a small circular window near the top. It reminded me of something you'd see on a ship or in a laboratory. The doorknob was ice cold, and when I turned it, the door creaked open with a sound that made my skin crawl. The room beyond was small and empty, except for a single item in the center, an old wooden chair. It was bolted to the floor, and leather straps dangled from the armrests and legs, as if it had once been used to restrain someone. The walls were covered in strange symbols, scratched deep into the plaster. I couldn't read them, but they made my stomach churn. I was about to leave when I noticed something else. Faint footprints on the dusty floor, leading from the chair to the corner of the room. They weren't mine. A cold sweat broke out on my neck as I swung the flashlight toward the corner. It was empty, just shadows, but I could have sworn I felt something watching me. "Marcus!" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I stepped back into the hallway, my heart racing. "Marcus!" I shouted this time. Still nothing. I made my way downstairs, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The living room was empty, but I could see Marcus's flashlight lying on the floor, its beam cutting across the room. "Marcus!" I said again, this time barely a whisper. Then I heard it, a low, guttural sound like someone or something was breathing heavily just beyond the doorway to the kitchen. I inched closer, the beam of my flashlight trembling as it illuminated the darkened doorway. The breathing grew louder, ragged and wet, sending chills down my spine. "Marcus, if this is a joke, I swear to God." I stopped mid-sentence. A figure stepped into the doorway. At first, I thought it was Marcus, but as the flashlight's beam hit it, I realized it wasn't him. It wasn't human. The thing was tall and thin, its limbs too long and its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to suck in the light. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and let out a sound that wasn't a growl, but something worse, something ancient. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight as I turned to run. My foot caught on something, and I hit the floor hard, my head spinning. The creature moved toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by an unseen hand. Just as it reached me, a blinding light filled the room, followed by a deafening roar. The creature stopped, its hollow eyes narrowing as it turned toward the sound. Marcus burst into the room, wielding a fire axe he'd apparently found in the house. "Get up," he shouted, swinging the axe at the creature. I scrambled to my feet as Marcus drove the creature back, each swing forcing it closer to the kitchen. It let out a high-pitched scream that made my ears bleed, but Marcus didn't stop. He kept swinging until the thing retreated into the shadows, disappearing through the doorway. "Run!" Marcus yelled, grabbing my arm. We didn't stop until we were outside, gasping for air under the cold night sky. The house stood silent and dark behind us, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my voice shaking. Marcus didn't answer. He just stared at the house, his jaw clenched. Finally, he said, "We shouldn't have come here." "No kidding, isn't." "What the hell was that thing?" Marcus looked at me, his face pale. "I don't know, but I've seen it before." We left without finishing the job. I never went back to that house, and I haven't spoken to Marcus since. But sometimes, late at night, I dream about that room, the chair, the symbols, the footprints, and in every dream, I hear it, that guttural, ancient sound growing louder, closer. I don't think it's done with me. Not a bad smell. Exactly. More like something out of place. A faint, sweet odor, like honey mixed with wet leaves. I noticed it one evening while sitting on my couch, the TV flickering softly in the corner. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, drifting through the open window. But when I closed it, the smell only grew stronger. I checked the kitchen. Nothing. The bathroom. Nothing. Finally, I found it in the hallway closet. The smell was coming from the walls. I pressed my nose closer, the sweetness almost overwhelming now, and felt a faint vibration, like something was moving inside. That should have been enough to call someone, a pest control company, a landlord, anyone. But I couldn't stop myself. I grabbed a screwdriver and started prying at the edge of the drywall. The smell hit me in a wave when I pulled the panel away, sweet and cloying, with a hint of something sour underneath. At first, all I saw was darkness. Then I shone my flashlight inside. There was something in the wall. At first, I thought it was just a mass of roots or old insulation. But as I leaned closer, I saw it wasn't a mass at all. It was moving. The shapes were small, about the size of marbles, and they pulsed in time with the vibration I'd felt earlier. Tiny veins ran through them, glowing faintly with a soft golden light. I reached out instinctively, my fingers brushing against the surface of one of the spheres. It was warm and sticky, almost alive. That's when I heard the hum. It was faint at first, like the buzz of a distant power line, but it grew louder, deeper, until it vibrated through my bones. I yanked my hand back and slammed the drywall back into place, my heart pounding. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shapes, felt their warmth, heard the hum. The next morning, the smell was everywhere. It seeped into the kitchen, the bathroom, even my clothes, sweet and sharp, clinging to the air like a fog. I called my landlord, but the line went straight to voicemail. By the second day, the hum had started again. This time, it wasn't coming from the wall. It was coming from inside the apartment. I followed it to the living room, where a single marble-sized sphere sat on the coffee table. It wasn't there before. I stared at it, my stomach twisting. The veins in its surface pulsed faintly, glowing with that same golden light. I should have thrown it out, burned it, done anything but what I did. I touched it. The hum stopped instantly, replaced by a sharp, high-pitched sound that made my ears ring. The sphere cracked open in my hand, and a tiny, writhing shape spilled out. It looked like an insect, but not one I'd ever seen before. Its body was translucent, its legs too long, its eyes glowing faintly. It crawled up my arm before I could react, its tiny legs digging into my skin. Then it spoke. Not in words, exactly, but I felt it in my mind, a rush of images and emotions too fast to process. Hunger, expansion, home. I swatted it away, but the sensation lingered, echoing in my skull. The insect scuttled into the shadows, disappearing under the couch. That was the last normal day I had. By the next morning, the walls of my apartment had changed. They were softer now, the drywall bulging in places, veins of golden light spidering across the surface. The smell was unbearable, sweet and rancid at the same time. The hum never stopped, vibrating through the floors, the furniture, my bones. I tried leaving, but the front door wouldn't budge. No matter how hard I pulled or kicked, it stayed locked, as if the building itself had sealed me inside. That night, I woke to find the spheres covering the walls, the ceiling, even the floor. And they were hatching. Tiny, glowing insects poured out of them, their legs clicking against the wood. They moved in perfect unison, like they were connected by some invisible thread. I tried killing them, stepping on them, smashing them with books, but it didn't matter. For every one I crushed, 10 more emerged. By the third night, the insects weren't hiding anymore. They covered every surface, their glowing bodies casting eerie shadows. And I wasn't alone. The first figure appeared in the corner of my bedroom, half hidden in the darkness. It looked human at first, tall and thin, with arms too long and a head that tilted unnaturally. Its eyes glowed faintly, the same golden hue as the insects. It didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. By morning, there were more of them. They stood silently in the hallways, the living room, even the bathroom, always watching, their glowing eyes following me wherever I went. I stopped eating, stopped sleeping. The insects didn't bother me anymore. They just crawled over me, their legs light as whispers. The figures grew bolder. They stood closer now, their bodies flickering like static. One of them whispered to me last night. "We're almost ready," it said, its voice like leaves rustling in the wind. I don't know what they're preparing for. This morning, the insects started to burrow. Not into the walls, into me. I can feel them under my skin, their tiny legs moving, their hum growing louder in my ears. The figures are closer now, their glowing eyes unblinking. And I think I'm starting to understand. This isn't my home anymore. It's theirs. It was the kind of job listing you scroll past and then scroll back to just to make sure you read it right. Seeking overnight museum attendant. $800 per night. No experience required. Discretion essential. The pay was absurd. Ridiculously so. I'd been unemployed for months and barely scraping by with gig work, so I sent in my application without thinking twice. 2 hours later, I got a call. The voice on the other end was clipped and professional. "Are you available to start tonight?" I hesitated. I didn't know much about museums, but I needed the money. "Yes." "Excellent," the voice said. "Report to the Harrowby collection at 10 p.m. sharp. Wear comfortable shoes. And bring a watch." The Harrowby collection wasn't like other museums. It wasn't even open to the public. Tucked away in a nondescript building on the outskirts of town, it looked more like an upscale library than anything else. When I arrived, the front doors were already unlocked, and the lobby was deserted except for a single man sitting behind a massive wooden desk. He was old, sharp-featured, and dressed in an immaculate suit. He introduced himself as Mr. Armitage, the curator. "You will remain inside the collection from 10 p.m. until sunrise," he explained, his voice crisp and measured. "Your duties are simple. Ensure the exhibits remain undisturbed. Should you hear or see anything unusual, do not investigate. Simply remain at your station. Is that clear?" I nodded, uneasy but too desperate to walk away. He handed me a key and a flashlight, then gestured to a heavy door at the far end of the room. "Good luck," he said, his expression unreadable. The collection itself was odd. It wasn't what you'd expect from a museum. There were no grand displays or polished plaques. Instead, the room was a maze of mismatched shelves and glass cases, crammed with objects that seemed to have no rhyme or reason. A porcelain doll with mismatched eyes, a rusted, ancient-looking sword, a painting of a woman whose eyes seemed to follow you no matter where you stood. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the only sound was the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I sat up at the small desk near the center of the room, as instructed. My job, it seemed, was to sit and do nothing. Easy money, I told myself. The first few hours passed uneventfully. I scrolled through my phone, trying to ignore the way the doll's crooked eyes seemed to stare at me. Then, at exactly 1:13 a.m., the lights flickered. I glanced up, my stomach tightening. The lights steadied after a moment, but the room felt different, heavier, colder. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling, like fabric brushing against wood. My first instinct was to investigate, but Mr. Armitage's warning echoed in my head. Do not investigate. I stayed at my desk, clutching the flashlight tightly. The rustling grew louder, then stopped abruptly, replaced by a soft, rhythmic tapping. It sounded like footsteps, but they didn't echo like they should have on the tile floor. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the sound. It seemed to move through the room, circling me, always just out of sight. Then the tapping stopped. I held my breath, the silence almost unbearable. A whisper broke the stillness. Who's there? The voice was soft, almost childlike, but it didn't come from any direction. It was everywhere at once, filling the room like a cold wind. My hands shook as I glanced at the objects around me. The painting of the woman seemed different now. Her lips, which had been pursed in a neutral expression, were curved into the faintest smile. I turned away, my heart racing. The whisper came again, louder this time. Who's there? I shut my eyes, gripping the edge of the desk. I'm not supposed to answer. I muttered to myself like a mantra. The room grew colder, and the air seemed to hum with energy. I could feel it now. Something was watching me. Not just one thing, many things. When I opened my eyes, the doll was no longer on its shelf. It was sitting on the desk in front of me, its mismatched eyes gleaming in the dim light. I jumped back, knocking over my chair. The flashlight rolled across the floor, its beam swinging wildly. Who's there? The voice was louder now, insistent. The tapping returned, faster, more chaotic, like dozens of feet scurrying across the floor. The flashlight beam landed on the sword. It was out of its case, hovering midair, its blade glinting. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in the lobby, slamming the heavy door behind me. Mr. Armitage was there, sitting at his desk, completely unfazed. You lasted longer than most, he said, scribbling something in a ledger. I was too shaken to respond. He stood, handing me an envelope stuffed with cash. Consider this your payment, he said. I assume you won't be returning? I shook my head, my hands trembling. As I left the building, the last thing I saw was the faint outline of the doll in the lobby window, watching me leave with its crooked, unblinking eyes. I don't know what the Harrowby collection is, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that voice in my dreams. Who's there? The first envelope arrived on a Monday. It was slipped under my door while I was at work, plain and unmarked except for my name written in neat, blocky letters across the front. No return address, no stamp. Just my name. I opened it cautiously, expecting a bill or a flyer. But inside was a single sheet of paper. The message was short, typed in the same blocky font as my name on the envelope. Do not go to work tomorrow. I stared at it for a long moment, my stomach twisting. It had to be a prank, some weird joke from one of my neighbors. I crumpled it up, tossed it in the trash, and forgot about it. The next morning, I left for work as usual. It wasn't until later that I realized what the envelope meant. Around noon, a car barreled through the front window of the cafe next door to my office building. A freak accident, they said. 2 people killed, several injured. If I'd been on my lunch break, I might have been there. I try not to think about it. Coincidence, I told myself. Just a coincidence. The second envelope arrived 3 days later. This one was thicker, heavier, with the same blocky handwriting on the front. My name. Inside, I found another typed message along with a map of the city. Avoid this area tomorrow. It is not safe. The map had a circle drawn around a specific intersection downtown, right in the middle of the financial district. I should have ignored it. I told myself I would ignore it. But when the time came, I found myself rerouting my usual drive, skirting the area just in case. That afternoon, the news broke. A gas line explosion had leveled an office building at that very intersection. I didn't know what to think. Someone was warning me. Someone knew these things were going to happen. And for some reason, they were trying to keep me out of harm's way. The third envelope arrived a week later. This time, the message was different. Meet me tonight. Midnight. The old parking garage. The old parking garage was a relic from a decade ago. An abandoned concrete skeleton on the outskirts of town. No one went there anymore, not unless they were looking for trouble. But I went. I don't know what compelled me to do it. Maybe I was hoping for answers. Maybe I was just desperate to know who had been sending the warnings. The garage was empty, the air damp and cold. My footsteps echoed as I climbed the stairs, each level darker than the last. I reached the top floor and stopped. A figure was waiting for me. They were standing near the edge, silhouetted against the distant city lights. They wore a long coat, their face obscured by shadows. "You got my messages," they said. The voice was calm, unremarkable, the kind you'd forget the moment you stopped hearing it. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "How do you know these things?" The figure tilted their head slightly, as if studying me. "You don't need to know who I am, only that I'm here to help." "Help?" I laughed, the sound brittle. "You're warning me about disasters and accidents like it's some kind of game." "Why me?" They didn't answer immediately. Instead, they reached into their coat and pulled out another envelope. "This is your next warning," they said, holding it out. I didn't take it. "No," I said. "Not until you tell me what's going on." Their shoulders stiffened, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of unease. "You don't want to know?" they said softly. "Trust me." "I don't trust you." They sighed, lowering the envelope. "You've been noticed," they said, choosing their words carefully. "Let's just say you're important. More important than you realize." "Important how?" Another pause. "Have you ever noticed how things around you break?" they asked. The question hit me like a slap. I thought back to the accidents, the close calls, the time the bus I was supposed to be on skidded off the road, the train that derailed after I decided to drive instead. I didn't answer, but they seemed to take my silence as confirmation. "It's not a coincidence," they said. "You're a fracture point, a hinge in the universe where events pivot. Things go wrong around you, catastrophically wrong. That's why I'm here, to keep the damage contained." "That's insane," I whispered. "Is it?" They held out the envelope again. I took it this time, my hand shaking. The message inside was shorter than the others. "Stay home tomorrow. Do not leave for any reason." When I looked up, the figure was gone. The next day, I stayed home. I didn't have a choice. Every instinct screamed at me to listen. Around noon, the bridge I would have crossed on my way to work collapsed. The death toll was in the dozens. Now, the envelopes come almost daily. Each one is a warning, a directive. I've stopped questioning them. I don't go to work anymore. I barely leave my apartment. But the accidents keep happening. The disasters grow bigger, closer. And last night, an envelope arrived that was different from all the rest. "It's coming for you. Be ready." I don't know what it is, but I think tonight I'm going to find out. The first time the phone rang, it was nearly midnight. I wouldn't have answered if I hadn't been waiting on a call from my sister. She'd promised to let me know when she landed safely from her flight, and my paranoia wouldn't let me sleep until I knew she was okay. So, when the old rotary phone in the corner of the room buzzed to life, I grabbed it without thinking. "Hello?" There was silence on the other end. Not just silence, an absence of sound, the kind of void that makes your ears strain to fill it. I pulled the phone away, staring at it like it might explain itself, then pressed it back to my ear. "Hello? Is someone there?" The click of the call disconnecting was my only answer. I hung up, chalking it up to a wrong number or some late-night prank, and went back to scrolling my phone. My sister texted me 15 minutes later, safe, landed, and heading to her hotel. Relief washed over me, and I was ready to write off the strange call entirely. But then the phone rang again. It startled me. The rotary phone was an antique, something I'd inherited when I moved into my grandmother's old house. I'd never even connected it to a line. The buzzing sound felt impossibly loud in the quiet room. I let it ring 3 times before curiosity got the better of me. "Who is this?" I snapped into the receiver. A pause, then faintly a voice. "Don't look." My breath caught. "What? Who is this?" But the call was already over. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house felt amplified. Every shadow stretched long and unnatural in the dim glow of the moonlight. I checked the phone twice, turning it over, searching for any sign that it was connected to something, anything, but the cord led nowhere. The next day, I convinced myself it had been a dream. Stress and an overactive imagination, nothing more. But when the phone rang again the following night, my blood ran cold. I didn't answer it this time. Instead, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the phone as it buzzed insistently. After the fifth ring, it stopped. I sighed in relief, but then my cell phone vibrated in my hand. A text from my own number. "Don't look." My hands shook as I stared at the message. I opened the thread, but there was no trace of it. Just an empty chat log, as if the message had erased itself the moment I saw it. I spent the rest of the night pacing the house, checking every lock, every window. Nothing felt out of place, yet the air had a strange weight to it, like the house was holding its breath. The phone rang again at 3:03 a.m. This time, I answered immediately, fury overtaking my fear. "What the hell do you want?" The voice on the other end was calm. "Flat. You're looking too closely." "Looking at what? Who are you?" The line crackled, the sound sharp and metallic, and for a moment, I thought I could hear breathing. Then the voice spoke again, and it wasn't coming from the phone anymore. It was behind me. "Don't look." I spun around, heart hammering, but the room was empty. Still, the words lingered, echoing faintly, like the voice had imprinted itself into the air. I didn't sleep for days. Every night, the phone rang, and every night, I ignored it. The voice never spoke again, but the buzzing filled the house, relentless and unyielding. Even unplugging the phone didn't stop it. It would hum and shake, the sound drilling into my skull until I was sure I'd lose my mind. And then one night it stopped. For the first time in over a week, the house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that makes you notice your own breathing, your own heartbeat. That's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, just beyond the edge of the lamplight, something moved. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even a shape I could name. It was like the space itself had bent, folding in on itself in impossible ways. My stomach twisted as I stared at it, unable to tear my eyes away. And then I remembered the words, "Don't look." But it was too late. The longer I stared, the clearer it became. The shape unfolded, revealing impossible details. Limbs that stretched too far, eyes that weren't eyes, a mouth that grinned wider than it should. It stepped closer. I screamed, scrambling backward, but the house seemed to shift around me. The walls twisted, the floor tilted, and I was falling, the world spinning into darkness. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor, the rotary phone sitting calmly next to me. The house was still, quiet, but I wasn't alone. In the corner of the room, the shape waited, its presence pressing against the edges of my vision. The phone hasn't rung since, but every time I close my eyes, I can feel it watching, and every so often, I catch myself looking back. I found the first one sitting on my desk at work. No envelope, no stamp, just a single postcard with a photo of a lighthouse on the front. It wasn't any place I recognized. The lighthouse stood on a jagged cliff, the sky behind it stormy and gray. On the back, in shaky, uneven handwriting, was a single line. "I saw you there." I stared at it for a long time, trying to figure out who could have left it. Nobody at the office would have done something this weird as a joke, and the handwriting wasn't familiar. I eventually tossed it into my bag, figuring it was some kind of mistake. The second postcard arrived a week later. This one was waiting for me in my mailbox at home. The picture showed a dense, foggy forest. The trees were gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The message on the back was shorter this time. "You don't remember, but you will." By now, I was thoroughly unsettled. I'd never been to a forest like that, never seen that lighthouse. But there was something about the postcards, the imagery, the words, that felt familiar. Like a word on the tip of your tongue, or a dream you couldn't quite recall. I asked around, casually at first, but no one claimed responsibility. My friends thought it was weird, but they didn't seem as unnerved as I was. "Someone's messing with you," they said. "Probably just a secret admirer." But that didn't feel right. The third postcard arrived 3 days later. This one was worse. The photo showed an empty, dilapidated room. The walls were peeling, the floor was littered with debris, and a single window let in a sliver of pale light. On the back, in the same shaky handwriting, were the words, "The door is open. I checked every door and window in my apartment that night, making sure they were locked. But as I walked through the rooms, I started noticing things I hadn't before. Small changes that didn't make sense. My keys weren't where I'd left them. A picture frame on my shelf was tilted at an odd angle. The kitchen faucet dripped even though I hadn't used it all day. That night, I dreamed of the lighthouse. I was standing on the cliff from the postcard, the wind howling around me. The lighthouse loomed ahead, its beam of light sweeping slowly across the ocean. The door to the lighthouse was open, and as I stepped closer, I heard a faint whisper. "Come back." I woke up drenched in sweat, the whisper still echoing in my ears. The postcards kept coming, one every few days, always with a new image. An abandoned playground with a rusted swing set. A desolate road cutting through an endless desert. A black, still lake reflecting a sky full of stars. Each one came with a message. "You left something behind. It's waiting for you. Don't forget." I couldn't stop thinking about them. They felt like breadcrumbs, leading me somewhere I didn't want to go but couldn't resist. The dreams became more vivid, pulling me back to those same places. The lighthouse, the forest, the room with the peeling walls. And then the final postcard arrived. It was different from the others. The image wasn't a place, it was a face. Meaning, the picture was grainy, black and white, but it was unmistakably me. My expression was blank, my eyes wide and unfocused, as though I'd been caught in the middle of something. And on the back, "It's time." I didn't sleep that night. How could I? I sat in my apartment, staring at the stack of postcards on my desk, wondering what the hell I was supposed to do. Every instinct told me to burn them, to get rid of them and pretend none of this was happening. But something deeper, something primal, told me it wouldn't matter. At exactly 3 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. No words, just an image, the lighthouse. The door was open, and there was a figure standing inside, just a silhouette against the light. The air in my apartment grew heavy, like the atmosphere before a storm. I heard a faint creak from the hallway, and when I turned to look, I saw it. The door. It was the same one from the postcard with the empty room, standing at the end of my hallway where no door should have been. The knob turned slowly, and I held my breath as it creaked open. Darkness spilled out, thick and impenetrable, like smoke that didn't move. And from that darkness, a voice whispered, "Come back." I don't remember walking toward the door, but I must have. The next thing I knew, I was standing on the other side, the air cold and damp against my skin. The hallway was gone. I was in the forest now, the one from the second postcard, the fog curling around my feet. The postcards weren't leading me somewhere. They were leading me back, and whatever was waiting here had been waiting a long time. I first saw her the night I moved into my new apartment. The building was one of those pre-war brick structures with a crumbling charm. The kind of place you rent when you want to feel like an artist but can only afford a view of the alley. My unit was on the 3rd floor, and the living room window faced the building across the street. That's where I saw her, standing in the window of the apartment directly opposite mine. Her hair was long and dark, and she wore a pale dress that almost blended with the curtains behind her. She wasn't moving, just standing there, staring out into the night. For a moment, I thought she was looking at me, but her eyes seemed unfocused, gazing past me or through me. I waved, half out of politeness, half to see if she'd respond. She didn't. I shrugged it off and got back to unpacking. Moving is exhausting, and by the time I finished, the girl in the window was the last thing on my mind. But the next night, she was there again. Same window, same pale dress, same eerie stillness. It was unsettling, but I told myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe she was waiting for someone. Maybe she was deep in thought. People watch the world from their windows all the time, right? Except she was there the next night, and the night after that. Always in the same spot, always wearing the same dress. She never moved, never waved, never acknowledged me in any way. By the end of the week, I couldn't stop thinking about her. I started to notice little details. The way her dress seemed slightly too old-fashioned. The way her hair never looked mussed by the breeze. The way the light in her apartment never flickered or dimmed. One night, I decided to watch her. I turned off all the lights in my apartment, so she couldn't see me and sat by the window, peering at her through a small gap in the curtains. She didn't move, not even a little. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. My eyes grew heavy, but she didn't budge. At some point, I must have dozed off. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was that the girl was gone. The second thing I noticed was a light in my apartment, a faint, flickering glow coming from behind me. I turned, heart pounding, and saw it, a reflection. In the glass of the window, I could see her standing in my living room. I spun around, but the room was empty. My chest heaved as I stared at the space where she should have been. Slowly, I turned back to the window, but the reflection was gone. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I convinced myself it was a dream. Sleep deprivation does strange things to the mind, and I'd been pushing myself too hard. That's what I told myself anyway. But when I looked across the street, the girl was back. Her head was tilted slightly now, her gaze sharper, more deliberate. She was looking at me. I tried to ignore her, pulling the curtains closed and avoiding the living room as much as possible. But no matter where I went in the apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. One evening, as I was brushing my teeth, I glanced at the bathroom mirror and froze. There she was, reflected in the glass, standing just behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, but the room was empty. That's when I noticed the handprint. A single, faint handprint on the bathroom mirror, small and smudged, as if someone had pressed their palm against it from the other side. I packed a bag that night, intending to leave, but as I reached the door, I heard a sound. It was faint at first, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. A knock. It was coming from the window. Against every instinct, I turned back. The curtains were still drawn, but I could see the faint outline of a hand pressing against the fabric, dragging slowly downward. "Let me in," a voice whispered. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was soft, almost pleading. "Let me in." I bolted, slamming the door behind me and running down the hallway. I spent the night in a cheap motel, too scared to go back. The next morning, I called my landlord, trying to sound casual. "Hey, who lives in the apartment across from mine? The one with the girl in the window?" There was a long pause before he answered. "No one lives there," he said. "That unit's been empty for years." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean? I've seen someone there." "Impossible," he said. "We sealed that apartment after the incident." "What incident?" I demanded. Another pause. "The previous tenant," he said finally. "She passed away. Suicide. Happened in the living room, right by the window. Poor girl had been standing there for hours before she jumped." I hung up without saying goodbye. I haven't been back to the apartment. I found a sublet in another part of town, far from the window and the girl who waits behind it. But sometimes, late at night, I catch a glimpse of her in my dreams. Always standing, always staring, and always whispering, "Let me in." At first, I thought it was a glitch. I'd be scrolling through Instagram or replying to a text, and suddenly, the screen would freeze. The colors would distort, the image pixelating into a mess of gray and black fuzz, like the static from an old TV. It would last a second or two, then everything would go back to normal. No error messages, no crashes. Just static, like a flicker of something not supposed to be there. I ignored it at first. Phones glitch all the time, right? But then it started happening more often. By the end of the week, the static wasn't just on my phone. It was on my laptop, my TV, even the digital clock on my microwave. Each time, it only lasted a moment, but it was enough to make my stomach churn. I wasn't scared yet. Not until the night I saw the shape. It was a Thursday. I'd stayed up late working, my eyes gritty and dry from staring at my computer screen. I just shut my laptop when the static hit again, rippling across the blank screen. This time, it lingered. In the center of the fuzz, something moved, a dark shape, tall and angular like the outline of a person. It was hard to make out, the figure barely visible in the swirling gray. But it was there. And then it turned its head. I slammed the laptop shut and shoved it off the table, my breath coming in short gasps. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring at the closed screen. I told myself I was imagining things. Sleep deprivation, maybe a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The static had followed me. The next day, I tried to pretend everything was fine. I went to work, chatted with my coworkers, and avoided looking at any screens for longer than a few seconds. But the static was everywhere. My phone buzzed with a notification, and when I glanced at the screen, I saw it a flicker of gray fuzz, just for a moment, as if something was watching me through the pixels. That night, the power in my apartment went out. I was in the kitchen, making dinner, when everything went dark. My phone's flashlight was the only light in the room, and for a moment, the silence was suffocating. Then the static started again. This time it wasn't on a screen. It was in the air, a faint crackling sound that made my skin crawl. I turned toward the living room, and that's when I saw it. The shape. It was standing in the corner of the room, its outline jagged and shifting, like it was made of static itself. It didn't have a face, but I could feel it watching me, its presence heavy and oppressive. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair, and the shape flickered. 1 second it was in the corner, the next it was closer, its form distorting like a bad signal. I ran. I don't know how I made it through the night. I slept with the lights on, my phone clutched in one hand like a lifeline. By morning, the static was gone, but it didn't stay gone. Over the next few days, the flickers became more frequent. The static followed me everywhere. On the bus, at work, even in the reflection of a store window. And the shape was always there, watching, waiting. The last time it appeared, it wasn't just in the corner of the room. It was on the other side of the window, its form pressed against the glass, even though I was on the 10th floor. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there, its jagged edges pulsing in time with my heartbeat. Now, it's in my dreams. Every night, I find myself in a dark, endless void, surrounded by static. The shape is there, closer than ever, its form flickering and twisting. It whispers to me, though I can't understand the words. But I can feel what it wants. It's not just watching anymore. It's waiting for me to let it in.